Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you genuinely grateful for that light switch by your bed. Imagine this. You're standing in your kitchen right now, but there's no electricity. None. No fridge humming in the corner, no microwave waiting to heat last night's leftovers, no overhead lights casting their clinical glow across the countertops. Instead, you've got maybe 3 candles burning, if you can afford them, and an open flame that's actively trying to burn your house down while you attempt to cook dinner. The sun is setting, which means you've got maybe 20 minutes of usable daylight left, and once it's gone, you're living in actual darkness. Not the cosy darkness of a dimmed bedroom. Real, absolute, can't see your hand in front of your face darkness. And this wasn't some occasional hardship. This was every single day of your life if you lived in 1800s America. You probably won't survive this. Seriously. Modern you, with your heated shower, your refrigerated food, your electric blanket, your smartphone flashlight, would last maybe 3 weeks before having a complete psychological breakdown. But here's the thing. People didn't just survive this. They thrived. They built nations, raised families, created art, fell in love, and somehow found reasons to laugh. They just did it all while covered in soot, perpetually exhausted, and in constant danger of dying from infected splinters. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below. Where are you listening to this right now? What's your local time? I love knowing that people from all over the world are settling in for this journey together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself waking up tomorrow morning, but you're not in your apartment or house. You're in a small cabin or a colonial-era farmhouse, and everything around you is filtered through a sepia-toned lens of reality that your modern brain can barely process. The walls are rough-hewn wood. There's no thermostat, just the actual temperature of the room, which in January might be somewhere between unpleasantly brisk and your breath is literally visible. Your bed is a rope frame with a straw mattress, and you're wrapped in quilts that smell like the previous 3 generations of your family who've used them. The truth about electricity in 1800s America isn't just that people lived without it. It's that the entire structure of human existence was built around its absence. Every single task, from the moment you opened your eyes to the moment you finally collapsed into that straw mattress, was shaped by the simple reality that when the sun went down, you couldn't see anything. This wasn't an inconvenience. This was the foundational fact that determined how you worked, when you slept, what you ate, and how long you'd probably live. And here's the wild part. People before electricity didn't experience darkness the way you might imagine it from watching a horror movie. They experienced it the way fish experience water. It was just there. It was normal. They developed entire systems of living that worked within this constraint. They understood fire and candle and moon and stars the way you understand Google Maps and electric lights. But that doesn't mean it was easy. It means they'd accepted something that would drive modern humans absolutely insane. The candlelit truth, which we're going to explore throughout this entire journey, is this. Life without electricity was a constant negotiation with reality. You couldn't fight the darkness, so you adapted to it. You couldn't fight the cold, so you built around it. You couldn't fight hunger, so you preserved and planned. And through all of this, you maintained dignity, community, and somehow found moments of genuine beauty in a life that was objectively harder than nearly anything you'll experience. So let's talk about what that actually looked like. Not in the sanitized, romanticized way that historical fiction presents it, but in the real, daily, grinding way that people actually lived. We're going to walk through your day from the moment you wake up until you collapse into bed, and we're going to do it in the dark without electricity, in 1800s America. And maybe, just maybe, by the time we're done, you'll understand why that electric light in your bedroom is basically a miracle. Dawn becomes something entirely different when it's not just an aesthetic shift in the sky, but an actual necessity for survival. You don't have an alarm clock. And no, your phone doesn't exist in this scenario, so don't even think about snoozing a notification. Your alarm clock is that rooster you can hear screaming its absolute lungs out somewhere nearby, and it's not asking nicely. It's not politely suggesting that maybe you should consider waking up. It's demanding, with the kind of urgency that nature has perfected over thousands of years, that you get your body upright and moving right now. But here's the thing that nobody tells you. Roosters don't actually wake up at a consistent time. This is one of those weird historical myths that's partially true, but mostly misleading. Your rooster wakes up when the first light hits its tiny bird brain, which means anywhere between 4:30 and 5:30 in the morning, depending on the season, the latitude you're living in, and apparently the mood of whatever rooster lives near your home. In summer, this could be before dawn actually breaks. In winter, it might be closer to 6 o'clock or even 6:30. So you don't get to sleep until some nice civilized time. You get to sleep until your body has learned, through months and years of repetition, to wake up right before the rooster does. Or you just accept that you'll be violently awakened and stumble through your morning in a fog of rage and confusion. Here's where it gets genuinely wild. Historians still argue whether the consistent early wake-up actually benefited people's health, or if it was just something everyone was stuck with and eventually got used to. There's research suggesting that segmented sleep, which we'll talk about more later, was actually the natural human pattern, and the Industrial Revolution's shift to consolidated sleep cycles might have messed with our biology. But that's a debate for another bedtime story. Right now, you're just lying there in the dark, listening to your rooster, and you're trying to figure out if you can steal another 5 minutes before someone in your household definitely needs you to wake up. The reality of dawn in an electricity-free world is that it's genuinely tyrannical. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot hit snooze. You cannot decide that today you're going to sleep in until 8 a.m. because you stayed up late and deserve a break. The sun is coming, and the sun determines everything. In summer, this might mean you're awake at 4:30 or even earlier. In winter, you might get a few extra hours, but that's because the sun is literally on the other side of the world, not because you get a reward for good behaviour. And when you actually do wake up, because the rooster has won, as roosters always do, you're not waking up to a dark room that you then illuminate with a light switch. You're waking up to gradual light. In the pre-dawn darkness, you can maybe make out shapes. Your eyes have had all night to adjust to the dark, so the amount of light coming through the window is actually enough for you to see vaguely. Not well, not enough to thread a needle or read fine print, but enough to know where the door is and what time of morning it probably is based on the angle of the light. This creates a strange kind of internal clock that modern humans have largely lost. You learn to read the quality of light the way you might read a digital clock. That pale grey-blue colour means it's probably 5 a.m. That slightly more golden grey means it's closer to 5:30. By the time the actual sun breaks the horizon, you've already been awake for a while and have probably started your day. And you can't fight this. Your body will eventually sync to it. Kids will be born into this rhythm and never know anything else. Now there's a quirky historical detail that adds another layer to this whole sunrise experience. In some rural communities, people use something called a knocker-upper. This was literally a person whose job was to walk around town tapping on windows with a long stick to make sure people woke up. Imagine having to rely on someone else to ensure you didn't sleep through the dawn. These people were actual employed members of society, especially in industrial towns, because the ability to regulate wake time was so crucial that some communities decided to professionalize it. This doesn't exist in rural farmland quite as much, but in towns and cities, the knocker-upper was a real profession, which is kind of hilarious when you think about modern alarm clocks as this revolutionary technology. The psychological impact of this consistent, unavoidable, sun-dependent wake cycle is something that probably affected people in ways we don't fully understand. You literally cannot be lazy in the morning. You cannot decide that today is a mental health day and you're staying in bed. The sun is up. Work is calling. People need you, and the work itself is determined by what the sun is telling you. If it's light, you do outdoor tasks. If it's approaching dusk, you need to wrap up and get inside. If it's night, you have a completely different set of tasks. There's no flexibility. There's no, I'll just work a little overtime tonight to catch up. Overtime isn't a concept that makes sense when your light source is a candle that costs more than you make in a day. So you stumble out of bed, probably cold because whatever room you're in isn't heated, and you immediately start your day. There's no shower, there's no coffee yet, though you might get some if you're lucky and someone's already got the stove going. There's no checking your phone, no email, no social media. There's just the day starting, whether you're ready or not, whether you slept well or not, whether you have any desire to be awake or not. And this happens every single day, consistently, reliably, like clockwork, except the clock is the sun and you have absolutely no say in how it works. The kitchen in an 1800s American home is where the magic happens, and by magic, I mean the kind of magic that actively involves potential disaster at every step. You're stumbling downstairs, or to the other room if it's a one-room cabin, and the kitchen is the first place you head because food is the priority. But you're not going to flip on lights and grab something from the fridge. You're going to approach what is essentially a contained fire that humans are relying on for survival, and you're going to try to cook breakfast without burning yourself, your clothes, your house, or anyone else in the immediate vicinity. The stove is almost certainly wood-fired. Coal might be used in some places if you're wealthier or live near a coal source, but wood is the default. And this isn't a modern wood stove with thermostats and careful airflow controls. This is an open or semi-open combustion chamber that you feed wood into, and the heat output varies depending on the wood type, how dry it is, how much air is flowing through the chamber, and honestly, probably the phase of the moon or your general attitude. You cannot control it precisely. You can only nudge it in directions and hope for results. Here's the mainstream historical fact that most people learn about kitchens in this era. Cast iron was the technology that made cooking without electricity possible. Cast iron pans, cast iron pots, cast iron trivets. These were the tools that allowed heat to be distributed somewhat evenly, and could handle direct flame without cracking. Cast iron was durable, could be repaired by a blacksmith if needed, and would literally last forever if properly maintained. A cast iron pan from 1850 is still cooking food today. That's not an exaggeration. This is actually one of the reasons cast iron has become trendy again. People are rediscovering that it's legitimately better than a lot of modern cookware. But here's the quirky bit that doesn't get mentioned as often. Cooking over an open fire with cast iron is an absolutely learned skill. There's no recipe that tells you cook at 350 degrees. There's no visual cue that's obvious to someone who's never done this. You have to learn how to read the fire. You have to understand the difference between the hot side of the cooking area and the cooler side. You have to know when to pull something forward and when to push it back. You have to develop an intuition about timing that comes from years of standing over a stove. And if you don't have that skill, your food gets burned on the outside and raw on the inside, or it burns to char, or it doesn't cook at all. There's no margin for error, and dinner is late. The danger here is absolutely real and constant. Fire in the kitchen isn't some abstract hazard. It's an immediate daily threat to your safety. Your clothes are made of natural fibres that burn easily. Your hair is long if you're a woman, and people didn't have the habit of tying it back the way modern humans do. The kitchen is small, and that stove takes up a lot of space, which means you're constantly navigating around it. And fire in a wooden house, which is what most people lived in, spreads quickly. Historians still argue whether the high frequency of house fires in the 1800s was primarily due to cooking accidents or to poorly maintained chimneys, but the reality is that both were huge problems and both were often happening simultaneously. The actual statistics are kind of shocking. Fire was genuinely one of the leading causes of death and injury in 1800s America, especially for women and children. A woman's skirts catching fire while she was cooking, that wasn't rare. That was an actual occupational hazard of being a woman and being responsible for the cooking. Entire neighbourhoods burned down because one person's kitchen fire spread to the adjacent wooden structure. We're talking about situations where wooden buildings were packed closely together with no fire department and no water pressure, and fire spread could consume entire blocks of a city. This wasn't theoretical, it was constant documented reality, and every single morning you're standing in front of this fire and trying to cook breakfast. You might be making porridge, which involves boiling water and grains together. You might be frying bacon or salt pork, which involves managing hot oil that will absolutely burn you if you're not careful. You might be baking bread, which requires a specific temperature in a secondary chamber, and which takes hours. You might be making eggs, if you're lucky and have hens, but boiling eggs requires careful timing because you can't just set a timer. You have to watch them, and somehow know when they've been in the boiling water long enough. The physical demands of this are intense. You're standing in front of an active heat source, feeding wood into it, managing multiple pots, moving things around, and doing this often while also half asleep because you woke up before dawn. Your clothes are probably damp from the morning humidity and the steam from boiling water. Your hands are perpetually at risk of burns. Your back hurts from standing. The smoke is in your eyes. And you have to do this every single day, multiple times a day. What makes it worse is the cognitive load. You can't multitask the way you might with a modern kitchen. You can't preheat your oven while you're doing other things because your oven doesn't preheat. It's only as hot as the fire you've currently got going. You can't boil water and fry bacon at the same time unless you've got two separate heat sources, which most people don't. You have to sequence your cooking carefully, plan what you're going to make and execute it in the right order, all while managing a fire that's actively trying to kill you. And then there's the aftermath. You don't have a dishwasher. You don't even have hot running water that comes from a tap. The pots and pans you cooked with have to be cleaned with cold water and some kind of abrasive substance. Maybe sand, maybe ash from the fire, maybe a cloth. The grease has to come off, but cold water won't break down grease effectively, so you're working harder to clean things, and everything stays in the kitchen, which stays warm from the stove's heat, which means bugs and rodents are attracted to the lingering food smells. Your kitchen is a place of constant danger, constant work, and constant filth that you're fighting against every single day. Water. Let's talk about water for a moment, because you need it more than you probably realise, and getting it in 1800s, America is not a simple matter of turning a tap. Water is essential for drinking, cooking, cleaning, laundry and animal care, and water doesn't get to come to you. You have to go get it, multiple times a day, every single day. In the best case scenario, you live near a well that's on your property or immediately adjacent to it. This is not something most people had. Wells required digging, which required either significant effort or hiring someone to do it, which required money. So a lot of people relied on a communal well, maybe in the town centre, maybe a quarter-mile or a mile away from where they lived. Some people had access to a stream or river and just used that. And some people, the genuinely unfortunate, had to rely on collected rainwater, or could only access water from farther away. The mainstream historical fact here is that a standard water well in the 1800s was dug 20 to 40 feet deep, and pulling water up from that depth required a bucket and rope system that was incredibly simple but absolutely labour-intensive. You lower a bucket, you hear or feel it hit water, you haul it back up, and now you have a bucket of water. But you can only carry so much at once. Usually, people use buckets that held around 3 to 4 gallons when full, which weighs about 25 to 30 pounds. Think about that. You're picking up something that weighs as much as a small child or a large dog, and you're carrying it multiple times every day. The quirky tidbit that people don't usually think about is that women, who did most of the water hauling in typical household situations, developed genuinely different upper body strength than modern women. Their shoulders, arms and backs adapted to constant heavy lifting. This wasn't because they were naturally stronger, it was because they spent their entire lives doing physical labour from childhood onward. And if you were a woman in the 1800s, you probably accepted that hauling water was just part of your body's job in life. But here's the calculus that makes this genuinely brutal. How much water do you actually need? Well, for drinking, you need about a gallon per person per day, minimum. That's 25 to 30 pounds per person. If you have a family of 5, that's at least 125 to 150 pounds of water that needs to be hauled to the house in a single day. If your well is 200 feet away, you're walking 200 feet there and 200 feet back with a heavy bucket. Multiply that by at least 5 trips, and you're doing a mile of walking with heavy loads every day just to keep your family in drinking water. But drinking water is just the beginning. You also need water for cooking, another gallon or 2 probably. You need water to wash the dishes, at least another gallon, heated up, which requires more wood and more time at the stove. If you have livestock, you need water for them, lots of it, especially in summer. A horse might drink 20 gallons a day, a cow drinks 30 to 40 gallons. Even chickens need clean water. So if you're running a farm with any animals, you're hauling an absolutely staggering amount of water. Then there's laundry water, which is a whole separate crisis that we'll get to in another section. But know right now that laundry requires heating massive amounts of water, and that water has to be hauled to where it's being heated. We're talking dozens of gallons, probably 50 or more, all of which have to be carried in multiple trips. Historians still debate whether the sheer physical labour of water hauling affected women's health and lifespan, but it definitely affected their daily reality. Some women's diaries from the 1800s mention hauling water so frequently that it becomes almost invisible in their writing. It's so routine, so constant, that it barely registers as worth mentioning, and yet it was happening multiple times every single day. Now, here's where it gets worse. The water you're hauling up from most wells is not clean by modern standards. It might be relatively clear, which people took as a sign that it was okay to drink, but it's probably contaminated with bacteria, parasites and other organisms that you can't see. If the well is near an outhouse, which in many cases they were, because you want water and waste products in the same general area, for reasons that made sense at the time but were absolutely catastrophic for public health, then you're drinking water that's literally contaminated with fecal matter. You don't know this is happening because the bacteria are invisible and you're just seeing clear water coming up. The water you're hauling is also probably never going to be truly clean. Even in the best case scenario, with a careful well digger and a properly sealed well, the water is going to have sediment and minerals that settle to the bottom. That white crusty stuff that builds up on your kettle, that's mineral content that tastes weird and that builds up in your mouth. The water smells a little odd sometimes and tastes a little metallic, but you drink it anyway because it's water and you need water. In some areas, depending on mineral content, the water tastes actively bad, like sulfur or iron. Some people had to boil their water to make it drinkable, which they attributed to making it clean, and in a way they were right because boiling does kill a lot of pathogens. But boiling also uses a lot of firewood and takes time, so most people just drank the water raw and hoped for the best. The physical toll of constant water hauling was enormous, but the psychological toll was equally significant. Water was a source of perpetual anxiety. Is there enough for the animals? Is there enough for laundry? Is there enough for cleaning? What if the well runs dry? What if it freezes over in winter? What if someone gets sick and needs extra water to stay hydrated? All of these were real concerns, and they all hinged on your ability to haul enough water, physically, to meet your family's needs. And you're doing this alone or with help from other family members who are equally exhausted. Darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a presence. It's a thing that exists, that constrains, that shapes how you move and think and exist. And in an 1800s American home after sunset, darkness becomes the defining feature of your experience. You cannot just turn on a light and keep living the way you would during the day. Darkness changes everything. The sun sets, and you've got maybe 30 minutes of usable twilight. That period where the sun is below the horizon, but its light is still bouncing around in the atmosphere enough for you to see vaguely. You can't read during twilight. You can't do detail work. You can move around. You can see shapes. You can manage basic tasks. But it's not functional light. It's transitional light. And once that's gone, you need an artificial light source, or you need to just accept that your day is over. So you light candles or lamps. Let's talk about candles first, because they're the most common light source for most people. Candles are made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat, usually from beef or mutton, or from beeswax if you're wealthy enough to afford them, or if you keep bees. Tallow candles are cheap but terrible. They smell, they smoke, they drip constantly, they don't burn very brightly, and they're greasy. Your hands get greasy handling them. Your clothes get stained if any of the dripping wax lands on them. The smell becomes part of your house, part of your clothes, part of your identity. Beeswax candles are beautiful. They burn cleaner, smell better, burn brighter, but they're expensive enough that most people can't afford to use them as a regular light source. You might get beeswax candles for special occasions or if you're relatively wealthy. For daily use, you're working with tallow, which means you're working with a light source that's actively making your indoor space worse while it's providing light. The mainstream historical fact is that lighting was one of the biggest expenses in a household budget. We're talking about 10 to 20% of a family's annual spending in many cases. This wasn't optional. This was a necessity. But because it was so expensive, most people were very conservative with their lighting. You didn't just light a candle whenever you wanted light. You lit a candle when you absolutely needed it, and you extinguished it as soon as you possibly could. This meant that a lot of evening activities happened in near darkness, with people relying on the faint light of a single candle or lamp in the centre of a room. Everyone gathered as close as possible to that light source. Here's the quirky detail. People became extraordinarily skilled at reading and doing detail work in incredibly dim light. That candle you think is barely providing any light? Someone in 1850 could do fine needlework by it. They could read. They could see clearly enough to navigate. The human eye, when you grow up without strong artificial light, is genuinely better at seeing in low light conditions. And when you have no choice but to function in dim light, you learn to function in it. But the psychological impact of this can't be overstated. Darkness means vulnerability. Darkness means you can't see threats. In a rural area, darkness means predators, actual animals, are more likely to venture near your house. In a town or city, darkness means you're more vulnerable to crime. Darkness means you're isolated from community because you can't easily see your neighbours. Darkness means you move slowly and carefully because you might trip or fall. Darkness means your world shrinks to the size of whatever space is illuminated by your light source, and the light sources themselves are dangerous. An open flame in a small wooden house is a constant threat. A candle can fall over, a lamp can spill oil. You're always one mistake away from your house catching fire, and fires at night are particularly dangerous because they spread faster in darkness. People have a harder time responding to them, harder time seeing what's happening, harder time containing them. Historians still argue about how much of the nocturnal behaviour of pre-industrial societies was genuinely safer and more sustainable, versus how much it was just resigned adaptation to a difficult reality. Some scholars suggest that the natural human rhythm is actually more aligned with earlier sleep and earlier waking, and that the post-industrial shift to late-night activity and later sleep is actually what's unnatural. But in 1800s America, the reality was simpler. Once it was dark, you lit a candle if you absolutely had to do something, and otherwise you probably went to bed. So here's what that means practically. You're awake from sunrise to sunset, roughly. During summer, that's 14 to 16 hours of potential activity. During winter, that's maybe 8 to 10. During the equinoxes, it's about 12 hours. Your day length changes dramatically by season, which means your rhythm changes too. Summer brings long days and short nights, which means you're working more, sleeping less, and probably always a bit tired. Winter brings short days and long nights, which means you're getting more sleep, but less work is possible, which creates a different kind of stress. The pressure that you need to accomplish everything during the lighter months because winter is coming and you won't be able to work as much. Light pollution, or in this case the complete absence of it, affects everything from your mood to your sense of time to your ability to feel connected to the broader world. If you can't see beyond your immediate light source after dark, the world becomes very small. Your entire universe is this house, this room, these people. You can't see what's happening beyond the walls. You can't read the weather in the sky. You can't navigate to anywhere you don't already know intimately. And this enforced insularity probably contributed to a certain kind of cultural stability. You knew your community because you lived intimately with them during the daylight hours and then retreated into close quarters at night. The fear of darkness was real, genuinely real. Not the irrational fear that modern humans might experience when the lights go out, but a practical, survival-based fear. Darkness meant you were vulnerable. Darkness meant you couldn't see who or what was out there. Darkness meant your world had shrunk to the size of a candle's glow. And once you were in your house for the night, once you'd lit what minimal light you could afford, you stayed there. You didn't venture out unless absolutely necessary. And if you did, you moved carefully, fearfully, with the knowledge that you couldn't see threats and threats couldn't see you, which was somehow not reassuring at all. The stench of everyday life in 1800s, America would absolutely destroy a modern human's ability to function. We're not talking about a mild smell or an unpleasant odour. We're talking about a pervasive, constant miasma of human waste, animal waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies that would be genuinely overwhelming to someone used to indoor plumbing, deodorant and regular showers. This isn't exaggeration or romantic horror. This is documented reality that people just lived with. Let's start with the most obvious culprit: human waste. There are no flush toilets in most places. There are outhouses, which are basically a hole in the ground with a structure around it, or chamber pots, which are containers that you urinate and defecate into, usually kept under a bed or in a corner, and which are emptied periodically. Outhouses are marginally better than chamber pots, because the waste is at least outside the house, but they're still in close proximity, usually within 100 feet or so. And in winter, when you don't want to go outside, you're using a chamber pot. The mainstream historical fact is that diseases like cholera and typhoid, which are spread through fecal contamination of water, killed more people than any other single cause in the 1800s. We didn't understand germ theory until late in the century, so nobody was connecting the dots between the proximity of outhouses and wells, between the smell of human waste and the water you were drinking. People just lived with the smell and died in mysterious numbers. Here's the quirky detail that most people don't consider. Smell was actually a health indicator, but in the wrong direction. People believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread through bad air, through smells. So when something smelled bad, people assumed it was dangerous, and they were kind of right, but not for the reasons they thought. The smell wasn't the disease itself, but it was an indicator that fecal matter and other pathogens were present. So when people smelled that overwhelming stench coming from the outhouse area, they were actually correctly identifying that something dangerous was happening, but they didn't understand why or what to do about it, except in some cases to move as far away from it as possible when possible. But the stench isn't just coming from the toilet situation, it's coming from everywhere. You've got animals living nearby, probably right near or attached to your house, especially in winter. Chickens, pigs, cattle, horses. These animals produce an absolutely staggering amount of waste. A single cow produces about 50 pounds of waste a day. A pig produces 5 to 10 pounds. Chickens produce continuous wet droppings. All of this waste is accumulating in the barn or pen, usually getting mixed with bedding material, creating a composted mixture that ferments and smells like hell itself. And this smell is pervasive. It soaks into your clothes. It gets into your house. It becomes part of the air you breathe. Your own body smell is probably unlike anything a modern human experiences. You're not showering. You might bathe once a month, maybe, or once a season, depending on what part of the country you're in and how much you care about cleanliness. Most people are wearing the same clothes for days or weeks, and those clothes are getting sweaty, dirty, and stained. You're not using deodorant. It doesn't exist. You're not changing undergarments frequently. So your body accumulates a layer of sweat, dirt, and bacteria that's just constant. This isn't because people were dirty. It's because regular bathing and water-intensive washing wasn't practical on that scale. You're doing the best you can with limited water and limited resources, but the end result is that you smell. The smell of your own waste products, not just fecal matter, but also sweat, urine, and the breakdown products of your skin and hair, becomes so normalized to you that you probably don't even notice it anymore. But to someone coming from outside, from someone from a different culture with different hygiene practices, the smell would be absolutely shocking. Food waste creates another component of the stench. You're probably eating food that's been preserved through smoking, salting, pickling, or fermenting. These are preserved foods specifically because refrigeration doesn't exist. But preserved foods smell distinctive. Smoked meat smells smoked. Fermented vegetables smell like fermentation. Pickled foods smell acidic and strange. You're eating these foods constantly, and your body is processing them, and the byproducts are being expelled through your breath and your skin and your waste. So you don't just smell like a person who hasn't bathed. You smell like a person who hasn't bathed and who's been eating fermented foods and who's probably got a slight case of malnutrition, creating a particular kind of body odour. Historians still debate whether people's ability to tolerate smell was genuinely different in the 1800s, or whether we're overestimating the amount of smell that would have been present. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming. Letters from the period mention smells constantly. Travellers between America and Europe mention being shocked by the smells they encounter. People from urban areas moving to rural areas and vice versa comment on how the smell is completely different. The smell wasn't invisible. People were aware of it, even if they were used to it. But here's the thing that really gets you. The smell becomes part of your sense of home. The smell of your house, your barn, your animals, your family. All of that creates an olfactory signature that you recognise. When you walk into your house, the smell tells you everything is normal. It's not a pleasant smell by modern standards, but it's your smell. It's familiar. It's safe. And on some level, you love your house and your life, which means you develop an affection for the smell of it too. Indoor air quality is genuinely terrible. You've got a wood-burning stove that's pumping smoke into the house and then into a chimney. But not all of the smoke makes it out of the house. Some of it lingers. Your eyes probably burn if you spend too much time near the stove. The walls accumulate soot. Everything has a layer of fine particulate matter on it. This is contributing to respiratory problems, lung disease, and a whole host of health issues that you're not even aware you're experiencing because you're just living your life. The smell is inescapable. It's in your house, in your clothes, in your food, in your body, and for most people you'll never know any different. You'll never experience modern plumbing, deodorant, regular showers, and synthetic fragrances. You'll live your entire life in a world that smells like human and animal waste, smoke, fermented food, and unwashed bodies. And you'll probably think that's normal because you've never known anything else. Laundry day in the 1800s is not just a chore. It's a full-time job that takes an entire day, requires multiple people, uses an enormous amount of resources, and is genuinely dangerous. And it happens every week, or sometimes every 2 weeks if you're lucky. Washing your family's clothes without a washing machine, without running water, without hot water on demand, is an undertaking that would break a modern human's will to live. Let's trace through what laundry day actually looks like. First, you need water. A lot of water. We're talking 50 to 100 gallons or more, depending on how much laundry you have. You need to haul this water to wherever you're doing the laundry, probably outside in good weather, or in the kitchen/laundry room in bad weather. Once you've got the water, you need to heat it. You build a fire under a large vat or kettle, and you heat the water until it's hot enough to actually clean clothes, but not so hot that it damages the fabric. The mainstream historical fact is that laundry days typically happened on Mondays, right after Sunday, which was a rest day. Monday was laundry because people needed time to recover before jumping into the most labour-intensive task of the week. This wasn't laziness. This was a practical decision based on the brutal reality of how much effort laundry required. Here's the process. You take a piece of clothing, let's say a work shirt. You soak it in hot water. This softens the dirt, sweat and grime that's accumulated. You then take a washboard, which is a ribbed wooden or metal board, and you rub the fabric against it using soap that you've probably made yourself from animal fat and lye. You rub back and forth, hard, working the soap into the fabric and trying to break up the dirt. This is intense physical labour. Your hands are in very hot water, your back is bent or stretched depending on the setup, and you're using significant strength repeatedly for hours. Once the item is washed, you rinse it. But you can't just run it under a tap. You have multiple rinse buckets, and you move the item from one to the next, squeezing out the dirty water and replacing it with cleaner water. You do this multiple times until the water running out of the fabric is relatively clear. Then you wring it out. You take this heavy, soaking wet piece of fabric and you twist it. You need to get as much water out as possible because every drop of water left in the fabric has to dry out, and that takes time and energy. Two people will often team up for this. They'll each grab an end of the fabric and twist it in opposite directions, wringing it out together. If you're doing this alone, you're probably just wringing it by hand and being less efficient about it. The quirky detail that people don't usually focus on is that wringing out wet laundry is genuinely difficult. A blanket that's been soaked in water is insanely heavy. A wet cotton sheet can weigh 20 to 30 pounds, and you're trying to squeeze water out of it. This is another source of significant physical injury, wrist problems, shoulder problems, back strain, that would accumulate over a lifetime of doing laundry. Once everything is washed, rinsed and wrung out, you need to hang it to dry. If it's good weather and you have a clothesline, you hang it outside where it dries quickly and gets a nice fresh smell from the sun. If it's bad weather, you hang it inside, which means your entire house becomes a laundry room with wet clothes draping from every surface. This moisture in the air affects the whole house, makes it damp and uncomfortable, and creates conditions that can foster mildew and mould. The whole process takes the entire day. You start in the morning, probably as soon as it's light, and you're still working in the afternoon when the last items are getting hung to dry. And you're doing this while also managing your regular household duties. If you're making dinner that night, you're doing that while the laundry is happening. If you have kids, you're watching them while wringing out wet clothes and hauling water. This is not a task that gets your full, undivided attention. It's a task that dominates the day while you're simultaneously expected to do everything else. The danger in laundry comes from multiple sources. The hot water can seriously burn you if you're not careful, or if you lose your footing near the vat. The lye soap is caustic and can burn your skin. The heavy lifting of wet fabric can cause injury, and the physical strain of the repetitive wringing and scrubbing motion causes chronic pain and joint problems. Women's health in the 1800s was affected significantly by the physical demands of laundry. Arthritis, chronic pain, repetitive strain injuries. These were probably more common than they are today, specifically because of laundry. Historians still debate the full extent to which laundry labour affected women's health outcomes and lifespan, but there's no denying that it was one of the most physically demanding regular tasks that happened in a household, and it had to happen frequently. You couldn't skip a week because you were exhausted or sick. Clothes needed to be clean, and someone had to do it. The emotional weight of laundry day was probably significant too. It was the one day of the week that was completely dominated by a single task. It was the one day that was genuinely miserable and exhausting, and it came around once a week, without fail. There was no postponing laundry day. There was no deciding that today you were too tired. The clothes needed washing, and it was happening whether you felt up to it or not. And the result of all this labour? Your clothes are clean, they smell fresh. They're probably rough and stiff from the drying, and you might need to soften them, which requires rolling them up while damp and then letting them dry again, or ironing them, which is another labour-intensive task we'll get to separately. But they're clean, and that cleanliness lasts until life and work dirty them again. And then, 7 days later, you're doing it all over again. Clothing repair in 1800s. America is not an occasional task that you do when something wears out. It's a constant, never-ending process that's basically part of your job if you're a woman, or part of your evening routine if you're anyone else in the household. Clothes are expensive, they take time to make, they use significant resources, and they're not easily replaced. So when something tears, you don't throw it away, you fix it. And you fix it repeatedly, probably dozens of times before the garment is finally too worn to be functional. Let's start with darning, which is the process of repairing holes in socks and stockings. Here's how it works. You have a hole in your sock. You take a needle and thread that you've either made yourself or purchased, depending on what you could afford, and you thread the needle. Then you basically weave new fabric into the hole, making small stitches, creating a patch that holds the sock together. This is detail work that requires good eyesight and steady hands, and you need to do it in decent light, which means you're probably doing it near a candle in the evening, squinting to see clearly. The mainstream historical fact is that darning was such a common task that it was taught to children as soon as they were old enough to hold a needle, usually around age 5 or 6. Kids who couldn't read or write were probably able to darn socks. It was a fundamental skill that everyone needed, and while kids were learning to darn, they were developing the fine motor control and focus that allowed them to eventually do other detailed work. Here's the quirky detail. Darning needles and techniques varied by region and by family tradition. Some families had specific ways of darning that they passed down, creating a kind of cultural signature in how they repaired their clothes. If you moved to a new town, you might darn socks the way your family did, and local people might darn them differently. These small variations in technique didn't matter functionally. The sock was still repaired, but they represented a kind of cultural identity and family knowledge that was transmitted through practice. Beyond darning, there's patching, which is how you repair larger tears or worn areas. You cut a patch from some fabric, maybe from another worn-out piece of clothing, and you sew it onto the damaged area. The patch might be visible, in which case you accept that your clothes look patched, or you might try to hide it by stitching it on the inside, which requires more effort but looks better. Patching is similar to darning in that it requires needlework, but it's usually bigger and slightly faster because you're making fewer, larger stitches. Button replacement is another constant task. Buttons get loose, buttons get lost, buttons break. You have a sewing basket or box with extra buttons, probably buttons that came from old clothes you've already worn out. You sew them back on or replace them. This is quick, maybe a few minutes per button, but buttons are constantly coming loose, so you're doing this regularly. And then there's hemming and seam repair, which are more complex tasks that might require the skills of someone who's genuinely good at sewing. If the hem of your pants wears through, someone needs to open it up, reposition it, and re-sew it. If a seam starts to split, someone needs to restitch it. These are tasks that take time and skill, and which often require the attention of someone who's actually good at sewing. The physical impact of all this sewing is significant. You're hunched over needlework, sometimes for hours, straining your eyes in dim light, making repetitive motions with your hands. Over a lifetime, this leads to eye problems, back pain, neck strain, and chronic hand and wrist pain. People who did a lot of sewing, which was basically all women and many men, probably had significant pain by the time they reached middle age. The psychological impact is equally significant. Mending is not a satisfying task in the way that, say, creating a new garment from scratch might be. It's maintenance. It's necessary but repetitive and never-ending. You fix a hole today, and next week there's another hole in a different garment. You're constantly fighting against entropy, constantly trying to extend the life of clothing that's inevitably degrading. Historians still debate the extent to which constant clothing repair affected people's sense of ownership and materialism compared to modern humans. But there's no denying that the experience was different. You didn't casually acquire clothing. You took care of what you had. You invested in it. You put effort into maintaining it. And when it finally wore out completely, you might repurpose the fabric into something else. A quilt, a backing for another garment, rags for cleaning. Nothing was wasted. There's also the issue of making new clothing. which is even more labour-intensive than repairing existing clothing. If you need a new shirt, you might buy cloth, which is expensive, and then you have to sew the shirt from scratch. This requires pattern knowledge, measuring, cutting fabric efficiently to minimise waste, and careful stitching. A skilled seamstress might be able to make a simple shirt in a day or two of work. A person who's less skilled might take a week, and if you're the person responsible for making clothes for your whole family, that's a significant portion of your time, especially if you're also doing all the mending. The intersection of textile work, making clothing, maintaining clothing, creating textiles, probably occupied something like 10 to 20% of women's time on average. Some women did more, some did less, but it was a constant background task that was always present. And this was on top of everything else: cooking, cleaning, childcare, water hauling, laundry. The work was relentless. But here's the thing that's often overlooked. Clothing was also a form of art and self-expression. Even though you were repairing, patching, and maintaining worn-out garments, you could still choose colours, you could still add decorative stitching, you could still take pride in your work. A well-maintained, carefully mended garment was a statement about your values, your skills, and your attention to detail. And within the constraints of necessity, people found ways to create beauty. Heat in an 1800s American home is not something you can control precisely. You can't adjust a thermostat. You can't turn up the temperature by 5 degrees. Heat is something you create through burning fuel, usually wood, sometimes coal, and it's something you manage as best you can in a structure that's probably not well insulated and has significant gaps in the walls, floor and ceiling that let heat escape. Picture yourself in January in an 1800s American home. The temperature outside is probably below freezing. The temperature inside, if you have heat at all, might be somewhere in the range of 45 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold. That's the kind of cold where you can see your breath. That's the kind of cold where water freezes in a cup if you don't drink it quickly. And you're living in this cold, you're sleeping in this cold, you're doing your daily tasks in this cold. The primary heat source for most people is a fireplace or a wood stove. A fireplace is inefficient. Most of the heat goes up the chimney instead of into the room. A wood stove is better, but still not great by modern standards. To get reasonable heat into your home, you need to burn a significant amount of wood. We're talking a cord of wood per month, or more, during the cold months. That's a lot of wood. It needs to be cut, split, stacked and dried. The process of preparing wood for winter starts in the fall, and is a major undertaking. The mainstream historical fact is that heating costs were one of the biggest expenses in a household budget, rivaling food costs in some cases. Wood wasn't always cheap, especially in areas where trees had been harvested heavily. Some people had to buy wood because they didn't have access to trees on their own land. Other people had the resource but lacked the tools or physical ability to harvest and prepare it. And preparing wood for winter was so labour-intensive that it was basically a full-time job for at least part of the year. Here's the quirky detail. People's clothing and living arrangements were structured around managing cold. Men's and women's clothing was heavy and multiple layered specifically because you were constantly cold. You wore the same clothes for days or weeks because changing clothes frequently meant exposing your body to cold, and that was dangerous. Families slept closely together, sharing body heat. Children often slept 3 or 4 to a bed. This wasn't unusual or tragic, it was practical. It was how you stayed warm. The physical danger of cold is significant. Frostbite, hypothermia and chilblains, a painful inflammation of the extremities in response to cold, were common problems. Women who were pregnant during winter had increased risks of complications. Children were more vulnerable to cold-related illness. The elderly couldn't generate enough body heat to stay comfortable in a cold house. So cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a genuine health threat. But the mental aspect of constant cold is probably equally important. You're always slightly uncomfortable. You're always slightly worried about heat. You're always aware that if something goes wrong with your heat source, if you run out of wood, if your fireplace stops working, if your stove breaks, you're in serious danger. That background anxiety is probably constant. The process of maintaining heat requires constant attention. You need to keep adding wood to the fire. You need to manage the airflow to get the right amount of heat without wasting fuel. You need to clean the chimney regularly to prevent fires. You need to deal with ash accumulation. This isn't something you do and then ignore. It requires active management throughout the day and night. And then there's the question of where the heat goes. If you have one source of heat, one fireplace or stove in your house, that's where everyone gathers. This creates a situation where one room is reasonably warm and the rest of the house is genuinely cold. Bedrooms are cold, hallways are cold. If you're trying to do work in a room that's not the kitchen, you're doing it in significant cold. Some families would close off certain rooms during winter to conserve heat, living in just 1 or 2 heated spaces. This meant that parts of your house were essentially frozen for months at a time. When spring came, you'd open those rooms back up and they'd slowly warm as the weather improved. But for the winter, those spaces were unusable. The poor, people without enough resources to heat their homes adequately, were in genuine danger. A family that couldn't afford enough wood to stay warm might spend winter in a state of constant low-level hypothermia. This would make them more susceptible to disease, more likely to die from infections, more likely to experience complications from other illnesses. Winter was a death sentence for some people simply because they couldn't afford enough heat. Historians still argue about the extent to which heating technology improved through the 1800s, and how much this affected mortality and quality of life. But there's no denying that cold was a constant, ever-present reality that affected everything from your physical health to your mental state to your daily activities. The celebration of spring wasn't just about flowers and warmer weather, it was about survival. Spring meant you'd made it through another winter. Spring meant the danger was passing. Spring meant you could leave the single heated room and move around your whole house. Spring meant you could take off the heavy layers and actually feel your body. Spring was relief, and it was a relief that had to be earned by surviving the cold. And then summer would come, bringing its own challenges of heat, and eventually fall would come, and the anxiety about heat would start again as you prepared for the cold months ahead. Your year was structured around heating, your mood was affected by it, your safety and health depended on it, and you had very little control over it. Food preservation in 1800s. America is not a hobby or a way to make fancy jams. It's the difference between survival and starvation. Winter is coming, and it's coming for 6 months. During that time, nothing grows, nothing is harvested. If you haven't preserved enough food to sustain your family through those months, you'll be hungry, possibly desperately hungry, possibly starving. So preservation isn't optional, it's essential. The most common preservation method is salt. Salt is cheap, or at least cheaper than other preservation methods, and it's effective. You take meat, fish, pork, beef, and you pack it in salt. Salt draws moisture out of the meat, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. The meat becomes very salty, which means you have to soak it before cooking to remove some of the salt, but it's preserved. You can store salt-preserved meat for months, or even longer. Smoking is another major method. You take meat and you expose it to smoke from a fire, which preserves it and gives it a distinctive flavour. The process can take days or weeks, depending on how much meat you're smoking and how much smoke you're generating. Smoking was often a communal activity. You'd have a smokehouse, and multiple families might use it to preserve their meat. The distinctive smell of smoked meat is something everyone was familiar with. Your house smells like it. Your clothes smell like it. Your breath probably smells like it if you've been eating smoked meat. The mainstream historical fact is that salt and smoke were so important to preservation that large salt works and smoking facilities became important centres of commerce in certain regions. Coastal areas had salt-making operations. Areas with significant animal husbandry had smoking facilities. These were as crucial to the economy as any other industry, because preservation was fundamental to survival. Here's the quirky detail. Different regions developed different preservation traditions based on what was available. Areas with access to salt had more salt-preserved foods. Areas with abundant hardwood had more smoked foods. Areas with specific climates could use sun-drying or freeze-drying methods. These regional differences in preserved foods created distinct food cultures. If you grew up in one region and moved to another, the food would taste different, not just because of different ingredients, but because of how things were preserved. Then there's pickling and fermenting. You take vegetables, cucumbers, cabbage, beans, and you submerge them in a brine of salt and often vinegar. This creates an acidic environment where bacteria can't survive, but where beneficial bacteria that create fermentation can thrive. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, became a staple food, providing vitamins and minerals through winter. Pickled vegetables provided flavours and nutrition, and the fermentation process itself was understood at some level, even though people didn't understand the actual mechanism. They knew that if you did it right, the food was preserved. If you did it wrong, it spoiled and you had to throw it away. Root cellars and similar storage spaces were critical infrastructure. A root cellar is basically a hole in the ground or a basement that stays cool year-round. You could store potatoes, turnips, carrots, apples, and other vegetables in a root cellar for months. The cool, consistent temperature and darkness prevented sprouting and rot. Not every family had a proper root cellar, but if you were at all successful, you had one. It was a sign of preparedness and relative wealth. Fruit was preserved through various methods. You could dry it in the sun, creating raisins or dried apples that could be stored. You could preserve it in sugar, though sugar was expensive, so this was more common for wealthy families. You could make jams and jellies, a much more labour-intensive process that required cooking fruit with sugar for extended periods and then sealing it in containers. Jams were a way to preserve fruit, but they were also somewhat of a luxury because of the sugar cost. The work of preservation was immense and happened during peak harvest times. In the fall, there was the butchering of animals for winter meat, a communal event where families worked together, and then the work of preserving all that meat through salting and smoking. At the same time, you were harvesting and preserving vegetables. This was the busiest time of year, often more intense than the growing season. You were processing food, preparing it for storage, making sure everything was correctly preserved. If you messed up, if your salt meat spoiled, if your pickles fermented incorrectly, you were in serious trouble. Historians still debate whether food preservation practices in the 1800s were as efficient as people believed, or whether significant food loss still occurred. Evidence suggests that spoilage was common, that storage conditions were often not ideal, and that people regularly experienced periods of shortage or hunger even after significant preservation efforts. So preservation helped, but it wasn't a guarantee of abundance through winter. It was a way of stretching available resources. The diet implications of preservation are significant. You're eating preserved foods for 6 months of the year. That means you're eating a lot of salt, which increases blood pressure and affects health. You're eating less fresh vegetables and fruits, which affects nutrition. You're eating a lot of preserved meat, which is heavy and protein-rich but also heavily processed by modern standards. Your palate adapted to these flavours. Your body adapted to this diet. But it wasn't optimal nutrition. It was survival nutrition. The psychological aspect of preservation was equally important. All of this work in the fall was done with the knowledge that it would carry you through winter. Success in preservation meant relative comfort and security through the cold months. Failure meant hunger and potential starvation. So there was genuine anxiety during the preservation season and genuine relief once the food was stored and you could relax knowing you'd made it through another year. Medicine without electricity, without refrigeration, without antibiotics, without vaccines, and without understanding how disease actually works is an absolutely terrifying prospect. If you get seriously sick in 1800s America, your chances of survival depend largely on luck. Will you happen to get an illness that your body can fight off? Will the treatment someone attempts make things worse or better? Will someone at least provide you with clean water and rest? These are genuinely open questions. The mainstream historical fact is that infectious diseases killed more people than anything else in the 1800s. Infections that would be trivial to treat with modern antibiotics, a simple cut that becomes infected, a childbirth complication, a respiratory infection, were genuinely life-threatening. People died from injuries that wouldn't even require a hospital visit today. People died from infections that would take one pill to cure in the modern era. But here's the starting point of 1800s medicine. Nobody understood germ theory. The concept that tiny organisms cause disease was not widely accepted until late in the century. Instead, people believed in various theories of disease causation. Maybe it was miasma, bad air. Maybe it was an imbalance of humours. Maybe it was something in the water, but not in the way we now understand bacterial contamination. Maybe it was just bad luck or God's will. Without understanding the actual cause, treatments were often either ineffective or actively harmful. Folk remedies were common. If you had a fever, you might be given willow bark tea, which actually contains salicylic acid, a precursor to aspirin, so it might actually help a little. You might be given a purgative to clean out your system, under the belief that illness was something that needed to be expelled. You might be bled. A doctor or healer would cut your vein and let you bleed into a cup, supposedly letting out the bad blood. Bloodletting was standard practice and is probably directly responsible for killing a lot of people who would have survived if left alone. Here's the quirky detail that's genuinely disturbing. Leeches were used for bloodletting. A doctor would apply leeches to your skin, let them feed on your blood, and supposedly this would help with your illness. Leeches were actually considered valuable enough that they were traded and collected. And there's a certain dark humour in the fact that leeches are now being used again in modern medicine, for specific surgical purposes, so the 1800s doctors were accidentally onto something. But for a fever, leeches were not helpful. Other treatments included poultices made of various plant materials, some of which might have had antimicrobial properties, some of which were completely ineffective. Mercury treatments for syphilis, which were toxic and often did more harm than good. Opium for pain relief, which worked, but which also created addiction. Alcohol for disinfection, which helped externally, but which people also drank to manage pain and illness. Cold water treatments for high fevers, under the belief that you could sweat out the illness. Surgery in the pre-anesthesia and pre-germ theory era is almost incomprehensible to a modern person. If you had to have surgery, say an amputation or a surgery, to remove a stone from your bladder, you would be 1. Given alcohol to drink to dull the pain. 2. Possibly given opium. 3. Strapped down because you would absolutely move when the surgeon started cutting. 4. Operated on as quickly as possible. Surgeons were valued for their speed, not their precision, because speed meant less time in agony. 5. Given no antibiotics afterward, so infection was a genuine risk. Anesthesia with ether and chloroform became available partway through the 1800s, which was revolutionary. But people were also suspicious of it, and some refused it on religious grounds, believing that pain was part of God's plan, so some surgeries still happened without anesthesia. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous medical situations you could encounter. Complications from childbirth killed many women. Infections post-childbirth, called childbed fever, were common and often fatal. Hemorrhaging was a risk. Difficult presentations could result in death of the baby or mother or both. There was no way to do a caesarean section safely. There was no way to stop a hemorrhage. There was no way to prevent infection. Midwives delivered most babies, and they had no formal training in many cases. The difference between a safe delivery and a fatal one often came down to luck and the individual health of the woman. Childhood diseases like measles, mumps, whooping cough and diphtheria killed significant numbers of children. These are now preventable with vaccines, but in the 1800s, they were killers. A child would get whooping cough and might suffocate from the intensity of the cough. A child would get diphtheria and might have a membrane form in the throat that blocked breathing. These were genuinely terrifying diseases, and parents had no way to prevent them and no effective way to treat them. Historians still argue about the actual mortality rates from various diseases in the 1800s, because record-keeping was inconsistent and cause of death was often recorded inaccurately. But there's no denying that disease was a constant threat, especially to children and women in childbirth. The average lifespan was significantly lower than today, not because there was a discrete disease killing everyone young, but because so many children died from preventable diseases that the average was dragged down significantly. Mental illness was treated through various methods, none of which were effective. If you had depression, you might be given tonics, basically alcohol with herbs or minerals mixed in. If you had anxiety, you might be given sedatives or opiates. If you had psychosis, you might be institutionalized in an asylum, where the conditions were often worse than anything you were experiencing before. There was no understanding that mental illness had biological causes. It was seen as moral failing or possession or constitutional weakness. The treatments were often cruel and always ineffective. The end result of all this is that medicine in 1800s America was largely faith-based. You went to a healer or doctor, you underwent some treatment, and then you either got better or you didn't. If you got better, both you and the healer felt validated. If you died, it was God's will or the severity of the disease or bad luck. The treatment probably had very little to do with the outcome, but nobody knew that. Sanitation in 1800s, America was abysmal by modern standards, and the consequences were deadly. Disease spread through contaminated water, contaminated food, contaminated surfaces, and just through general filth. Rats and other rodents were constant companions in most homes and buildings. Insects, fleas, lice, bedbugs infested people and spaces, and all of this created an environment where disease thrived. Let's start with the rats. You cannot overstate how many rats were in 1800s American buildings. They lived in the walls, in the cellars, in the attics, in the spaces between the floor and the ground. They ate your stored food. They defecated in your pantry. They died in your walls, creating nauseating smells as they decomposed. They bit people, especially sleeping children. They transmitted diseases, and you had no effective way to get rid of them. You could set traps, you could poison them, you could get a cat or a dog, but you were never going to eliminate rats from your building. They were permanent residents. The mainstream historical fact is that plague is transmitted by fleas that live on rats, and while major plague epidemics weren't happening in 1800s, America like they had in medieval Europe, the rats and fleas were absolutely present. Rat bites and flea bites transmitted various diseases, and the fleas, oh the fleas, if you have rats, you have fleas, and if you have fleas, you're infested. Fleas bite you, they itch intensely, you scratch, the scratches get infected, you develop infections. Bedbugs were similarly ubiquitous. You'd lie down in bed and bedbugs would bite you all night. You'd wake up covered in itchy welts. Lice were common, especially in children. The psychological and physical toll of living with constant insect infestation is difficult to overstate. You can't get comfortable. You can't sleep without being bitten. You're constantly itching. The scratches get infected. You develop open sores that get dirty and infected. And this was normal. This was just part of life. You didn't think of it as a sign of unclean conditions. You thought of it as unfortunate, but inevitable. Here's the quirky detail. People tried various remedies for bedbugs and lice. They'd boil their bedding, which would kill the bugs but only temporarily, because new ones would move in. They'd use tobacco smoke, thinking the smell would repel insects. They'd use various oils and unguents on their skin and hair. None of these were very effective. The bugs would always return. So you learned to live with them. Sanitation in terms of waste management was a nightmare. Outhouses were the default, and they often weren't far from wells. This meant that the water you were drinking was contaminated with fecal matter. It might take a while for the bacteria to reach the well, but it got there. Cholera, typhoid, and other bacterial infections spread through this route. People didn't understand the connection, so they didn't understand why their communities experienced periodic outbreaks of illness. They blamed miasma, or bad air, or God's will. Inside homes, sanitation was minimal. There was no running water for washing. You washed with water from a bucket using whatever soap you had. If you were poor, you might not have much soap. Your hands didn't get truly clean, especially if you'd been working with animals or food. Diseases spread from hand to mouth. Diseases spread through contaminated food that you didn't adequately clean or cook. Garbage disposal was non-existent. You had leftover food scraps. You had broken items you didn't want. You had waste from processing food and textiles. Where did it go? Sometimes you buried it. Sometimes you threw it in a pile outside. Sometimes you dumped it in the nearest stream or ravine. But it accumulated. It attracted rats and insects. It created breeding grounds for disease. The working conditions in slaughterhouses, tanneries, and other industrial facilities with sanitation issues were horrifying. Animals were processed in conditions that were filthy. Workers came into contact with blood and waste continuously. Diseases spread. Infections were common. Workers lived in crowded conditions in cities, and disease spread quickly through these communities. Hospitals, when they existed, were basically disease incubators. You came in with one problem and left with an infection from the hospital environment. Surgery in a hospital was particularly dangerous because the surgical environment wasn't sterile. Surgical instruments weren't sterilized. Surgeons didn't wash their hands between patients. The idea that dirty hands could transmit disease was not widely accepted. Historians still debate the exact mechanisms by which disease spread in the 1800s, because documentation was inconsistent and understanding of disease was poor. But there's no denying that sanitation was abysmal and that disease was rampant as a result. The seasonal patterns of disease are worth noting. Cholera and other diseases spread through contaminated water were worse in summer when water stagnated and bacteria multiplied. Respiratory diseases were worse in winter when people were crowded indoors. Diseases like malaria, spread by mosquitoes, were worse in areas with standing water and warm summers. Your year included a constant worry about which diseases were likely at different times. Disease was not something that happened occasionally to unlucky people. Disease was something that everyone expected to encounter regularly. A family might lose a child to measles, expect it as tragedy, but also as inevitable. Someone would die from an infection, and it would be sad but not shocking. The question wasn't whether you'd encounter serious disease. You would. The question was whether you'd survive it. Work in 1800s. America is not a job. It's not a career. It's not something you do for 9 hours a day and then stop. Work is life. Your entire existence is structured around working from the moment you're strong enough to contribute until you're too old or sick to contribute anymore. And the rhythm of that work is determined entirely by the sun. If you're a farmer, which most people are, your work follows the seasons. Spring is planting season, which requires constant labour, preparing soil, sowing seeds, maintaining fields. Early summer is weeding and tending. Mid to late summer is harvesting some crops like hay. Fall is the intense harvest of most crops. Winter is lower intensity but includes maintenance, animal care and preparation work. You're never truly not working. Even in winter, when the fields are dormant, you're maintaining equipment, caring for animals, doing repairs, preserving food. The rhythm is dictated by the land and the weather. But here's the thing, the work is also dictated by light. You wake at sunrise, you work, you stop at sunset. You cannot work in the dark, it's too dangerous, too difficult to see. So in summer, you're working 14 plus hours a day. In winter, you're working maybe 8 to 10 hours a day. Your workload literally changes with the seasons in a way that no amount of effort can change. You cannot will yourself to work longer during winter because there's no light to work by. The mainstream historical fact is that the average work week in the 1800s was probably around 70 hours or more, significantly more than the modern 40-hour week. But that's misleading because the work wasn't consistent. In busy seasons, you might work 80 plus hours. In slower seasons, you might work 30 or 40. But during peak times, harvest in particular, you were working sunrise to sunset, which might be 14 plus hours, 7 days a week until the job was done. Work-life balance is not a concept that exists. If you're not a farmer, you might be a tradesperson, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a mason, a weaver. These trades have their own seasonal demands. A blacksmith is probably busier in certain seasons. Maybe spring when farming equipment needs repair, maybe fall when equipment needs to be prepared for winter. A carpenter might have more work in spring and summer. Everyone's work is affected by seasonal demands that you can't control. And then there's the physical demand. Work in the 1800s is physically intensive. You're moving your body constantly. You're lifting, carrying, digging, building, sewing, processing. There's no sitting in an office. There's no minimal movement. Your muscles are engaged. Your joints take constant stress. By the time you're 40, your body's probably broken down. Your back hurts. Your hands hurt. Your knees hurt. You're probably still working because you have no choice. You can't retire on Social Security because it doesn't exist. You work until you die. Here's the quirky detail. There's actually some evidence that people who did manual labour throughout their lives had better bone density in certain areas than modern sedentary people. Probably because the constant mechanical stress stimulated bone formation. But this advantage was offset by higher rates of arthritis, degenerative disc disease, and chronic pain from years of hard work. So yes, maybe your bones were denser, but you also hurt constantly. Children worked alongside adults, contributing what they could. Young children couldn't do heavy work, but they could do lighter tasks. A 5-year-old could collect eggs, pull weeds, watch younger siblings. A 10-year-old could do significant work. By the time you were a teenager, you were doing work that was almost equivalent to an adult. Childhood as a protected time where you're not expected to work is a modern invention. In the 1800s, everyone in the family contributed as soon as they physically could. Dangerous work was part of regular life. Farmers lost fingers and hands to machinery. People fell from roofs while doing repairs. People suffered burns from cooking fires and heating fires. Infections from injuries were common and often led to serious illness or death. There was no safety equipment. There was no regulation. You just did the work and hoped you didn't get hurt, but if you did, you dealt with it. The mental strain of constant work was probably significant too. You're not taking breaks for leisure. You're not stopping work to do something you enjoy. Work is what you do. You wake up and work until it's too dark to work. In winter, maybe you have some time in the evening for leisure. Maybe you do needlework or sit by the fire. But in summer, when you're working 14-plus-hour days, you have no time for leisure. You work, you eat, you sleep, you repeat. Historians still debate whether pre-industrial workers had more or less leisure time than industrial workers. But in terms of continuous daily work, the agricultural schedule was relentless. You were always aware that there was work to be done. You were always either doing it or aware that you should be doing it. The mental burden of perpetual obligation probably affected mental health. in ways we don't fully understand, and the end result? You're exhausted. Perpetually, chronically exhausted. You're working from sunrise to sunset during busy seasons, and you're never truly rested because the next day brings more work. You become numb to it. It's just what life is. You don't expect leisure or rest. You expect work. Childhood in 1800s America is not what modern people imagine when they hear the word. There's no school in most places. Education is either non-existent or available only in limited amounts, and it's only available for children whose families can spare them from work. There's no organised play or structured activities. There's no safety equipment. No one worrying about, is this age appropriate? There's just life, in all its harsh reality, and you're thrown into it as soon as you're able to walk and hold something. You might die. This is the first and most important fact about childhood in the 1800s. Infant mortality is catastrophically high by modern standards. Something like 30 to 40% of children die before age 5, maybe more in urban areas or in communities dealing with epidemics. You might die from disease, from accident, from malnutrition, from a combination of factors. Your parents loved you, but they also kind of expected some of their children to die. They probably had more children than they wanted, partly because they expected some would die. This is not morbid. This is practical reality. And it shapes everything about childhood. The mainstream historical fact is that children were integrated into the work of the household from a very young age. They weren't protected from work. They were expected to contribute. A 6-year-old was probably doing simple tasks. A 10-year-old was doing significant work. A teenager was doing near-adult work. The idea that childhood is a protected time away from responsibility is modern. Here's the quirky detail. Some childhood games and activities were actually simulations of adult work. Kids played house, which taught them the tasks they'd be doing as adults. Kids played with dolls that they made themselves. Kids played games that involved skills they'd need. Physical games that built strength. Games that taught strategy. Play wasn't separate from preparation for adulthood. It was part of the same continuum. Education, when it existed, was primarily for boys, especially in wealthier families. Girls might get a little education, or might not. The goal of education for boys was usually to make them literate and numerate enough to do business or trade. Education for girls, if it happened, was usually more focused on deportment and social skills. A lot of children got no formal education at all. They learned by doing, by watching adults, by being taught specific skills by family members. Reading was a skill you either had or didn't have, and it was not universally distributed. Maybe 50 to 60% of people were literate, depending on the region and time period, and literacy rates varied wildly by gender and social class. If your family couldn't read, you probably couldn't read either, because you learned from your parents. Schools, when they existed, were probably one-room schoolhouses with one teacher covering multiple ages and grades, or perhaps just meeting seasonally when children could be spared from farm work. The psychological impact of mortality was probably significant. You grew up expecting people, including yourself, to die. This wasn't traumatic because you didn't know any different, but it probably affected your approach to relationships and your emotional development. You might love your parents and siblings, but you were also kind of emotionally prepared for them to die. You might expect yourself to die. This isn't depression, it's just reality. You also didn't have a private space that was your own. You shared a bed with siblings, you shared a room. Privacy was not a concept. Everyone knew everything about everyone. This probably shaped how you related to other people. You were never alone, so solitude would be shocking and probably unpleasant. Intimacy wasn't special, because you'd been living in physical intimacy your whole life. By the time you were a teenager, you were potentially the physical equal of an adult. You'd been working your whole life, building strength. You were expected to contribute fully to the family's survival, and not long after that you were probably expected to form your own family, to marry and have children and take on adult responsibilities. Childhood ended quickly. Sometime in your teens you became an adult, and that was that. Girls' futures were relatively clear. Marry, have children, keep house. Boys' futures depended on what their family did. Farm, trade, labour. Your future was probably going to be similar to your parents' life. You didn't really have choices about that. The lack of entertainment meant that boredom wasn't an issue. There was always work to do. The lack of external dangers in the immediate environment. You probably knew your neighbours and your community and weren't exposed to much violence or crime, meant that some aspects of childhood were relatively safe, even if health risks were high. You played outside, did chores, worked alongside family. Your day was structured by the work that needed doing. Historians still debate the extent to which children in pre-industrial societies experienced childhood as a distinct life phase versus simply being young adults. Some evidence suggests that medieval and early modern societies didn't really have a concept of childhood as we do. Children were just small adults. By the 1800s, there's some evidence of a developing concept of childhood, especially among wealthier classes. But for working class families, childhood was essentially just being a small person who contributed what you could to survival. The end result is that you reached adulthood with work skills, with physical strength, with an understanding of adult responsibilities, but with no adolescence as a transition period. You went from doing child-level work to doing adult-level work over a few years, and then you were an adult. There was no extended period of being a teenager, of figuring out your identity, of developing independence from your parents. You transitioned quickly and took on your role in adult society. Entertainment in the pitch-dark evenings before electric lights is not what modern entertainment looks like, and it's probably not what you'd instinctively think of either. There's no television, no radio, no recorded music. There are no movies, no video games, no internet. There's very limited printed material. Books and newspapers exist, but are not universally available, and reading requires decent light, which is expensive. So how do people entertain themselves? For many people, especially those in rural or isolated areas, entertainment is mostly social. You gather with other people and you spend time together. This might mean visiting neighbours, sitting on a porch in summer, gathering at someone's house in winter. You talk, you share news, gossip, stories. If you live in a town, there might be more opportunities for organised entertainment. Dances, church socials, taverns. Music is a major form of entertainment. If you have any musical skill, you might play an instrument. Instruments were relatively simple: fiddles, flutes, drums, etc. Music making wasn't seen as requiring special talent the way modern people see it. People learned songs the way they learned everything else, by doing it, by learning from others, by repetition. A person with a fiddle could entertain a gathering. People would sing together. You didn't need to be a musician to participate in music. The mainstream historical fact is that dancing was a major social event. A dance would be held in a barn, in a church hall, or in someone's home. A musician or a few musicians would play. People would dance, not the choreographed dances of formal balls, but country dances, reels, and group dances where large numbers of people could participate. A dance was a big event. People would attend from the surrounding area. It was a chance to socialise, to see people outside your immediate family, to have fun. Here's the quirky detail. Some regions had strong traditions of specific dances or music styles that became cultural identity markers. Scottish folk had certain dances and music. Irish folk had different ones. African American communities had their own music traditions. These traditions were passed down orally and through practice. You learned the dances by doing them. You knew the songs because you heard them from childhood. The music was part of who you were. Storytelling was huge. If you had someone who was a good storyteller, they were valuable. They would tell stories, folk tales, historical events, gossip about people, dramatic stories designed to entertain. These stories would be told repeatedly with variations. Kids grew up hearing the same stories over and over, learning them, and eventually telling them to their own kids. This was how cultural knowledge and entertainment were transmitted. Games provided entertainment. Card games were popular if you had cards, which depended on access to manufactured playing cards. Board games existed but were less common. Dice games happened. Physical games and sports happened. Racing, wrestling, throwing competitions. These required minimal equipment and provided entertainment, and also served as a way to test strength and skill. Crafting provided a kind of entertainment while also being productive. If you're a woman, you might spend time sewing, and while sewing you might socialise with other women. Quilting bees were social events where women gathered, worked on quilts together, socialised, ate and spent time. This wasn't purely entertainment. The quilts were necessary, but it was also genuinely social. Similarly, communal work events like barn raisings were partly work and partly social. Religious activities provided structure and entertainment. Church services, religious holidays, religious festivals, these were social events. You'd dress up, you'd see community members, you'd listen to a sermon. Some denominations had music, singing, emotional participation. These were events to attend, things to participate in. Reading, if you were literate and had access to books, could be entertainment. But books were expensive and not universally available. Newspapers might be available in towns and people would read them. Almanacs, compendiums of practical information mixed with folk wisdom were common. If you had any reading material, you might read it repeatedly, extracting what you could from it. Drinking was entertainment. Taverns existed in towns and villages. Alcohol was cheaper and safer than water in many cases, so drinking was common. A tavern was a place to socialise, gather news, play games. For men especially, taverns were important social centres. Historians still debate whether entertainment in pre-industrial societies was genuinely less or more satisfying than modern entertainment. Some research suggests that people were less bored because they had direct social engagement, whereas modern people might be more bored because entertainment is passive and isolated. But there's no denying that entertainment options were vastly different and much more limited. For children, entertainment was usually play, which was unsupervised and often dangerous. You'd play with other kids, make your own toys, invent games. You had to entertain yourselves because adults were busy. This probably encouraged more creativity but also resulted in more injuries. But it was what childhood was. The lack of electronic entertainment meant that your leisure time was probably spent with other people, talking, playing, working on crafts together. This created strong social bonds and a sense of community, but it also meant no privacy and no escape from social obligations. You couldn't just retreat into yourself. You were always part of the group. Communication across distance in 1800s America is slow, expensive and uncertain. If you want to send a message to someone in another town or another state, you can't just send an email or make a phone call. You write a letter, and then you have to figure out how to get it to the person you're writing to. This might take days, weeks, or even months, and there's no guarantee the letter will arrive. The primary method of communication is the mail system. Letters are written by hand, folded, sealed with wax, if you can afford it, addressed, and then delivered to a post office, or given to someone who's travelling to the destination. From there, the mail is collected and transported, usually by horse, sometimes by stagecoach, sometimes by canal boat or riverboat, depending on the route. The mail travels slowly, and it travels on schedules that are determined by the need of people travelling those routes, not by urgency. The mainstream historical fact is that postal service was one of the first nationwide systems established by the federal government. Benjamin Franklin was actually the Postmaster General for a time. The post office connected communities and was a crucial part of maintaining a sense of national unity. But it was slow. A letter from New York to California in the 1850s might take weeks or months depending on the route and the season. Here's the quirky detail. Mail delivery in smaller communities was often handled by local merchants or tavern keepers. You didn't necessarily have a dedicated mailman. You might check at the local tavern to see if any mail had arrived. This meant that mail became social events. You'd go check for mail, and while you were there, you'd get news, gossip, and social interaction. Letter writing itself was an art. People were formal and careful in their writing because paper was somewhat expensive, and because letters might be read aloud to groups of people. Remember, not everyone was literate, so letters were sometimes shared. People packed a lot of information into letters to justify the effort and expense of sending them. A letter might be several pages long. The privacy of mail was not guaranteed. Letters passed through multiple hands. Postal workers might read them. People might open mail that wasn't addressed to them out of curiosity. If you had something you wanted to keep private, you couldn't really rely on a letter to maintain that privacy. If you wanted to send something important, documents, money, you had to trust someone to carry it. This was dangerous. People could lose the item, pocket it, or it could be stolen in transit. Some people made their living as messengers or couriers, carrying important materials over long distances. This was a risky profession. You could be robbed. You could be attacked. For time-sensitive communication, you might pay extra for express delivery, but this was expensive and still unreliable. If you needed to communicate something urgent, you might send multiple copies by different routes, hoping that at least one would arrive, or you might wait until you saw someone who was travelling to your destination and ask them to carry a message. Newspapers provided a form of long-distance communication, but in a different way. Newspapers from different regions would be exchanged, passed around, shared. If you had news in one town, you might see it published in a newspaper, and then that newspaper might be sent to other places and reprinted. News travelled through the network of newspapers, but slowly, and sometimes with significant distortion, as it passed through multiple sources. Personal relationships were heavily affected by the limitations of communication. If you moved away from family, you might not see them again for years. Communication via letters was the primary way to maintain relationships. If someone died, it might take weeks for distant family to hear the news. By the time they received the news and travelled to the funeral, it might be over. Distance was isolating. Historians still debate whether the limited communication created a stronger sense of community and place, or whether it created isolation and loneliness. There's evidence for both. People were more connected to their immediate community because distance made broader connections difficult, but people were also isolated from broader networks and were less aware of what was happening outside their immediate sphere. The psychological impact of slow communication was probably significant. You didn't expect immediate responses. You didn't expect to hear from distant friends or family frequently. You lived in a state of relative ignorance about what was happening outside your immediate area. Major events, battles, political changes, economic crises might take weeks or months to reach you, and by then the situation had probably already evolved significantly, and waiting for mail created its own kind of anxiety. You'd sent a letter, and you didn't know if it would arrive. You were waiting for a response, and you didn't know if it would come. You might be waiting for important news about business, about family, and that waiting was stressful, but it was just part of life. You got used to uncertainty and delay. Commerce in 1800s, America without electricity is a fundamentally different process than modern commerce. You don't have access to standardized goods. You don't have chain stores. You don't have warehouses stocked with manufactured goods. You have local craftspeople and merchants who are producing or acquiring goods for sale. And if you need something, you either make it yourself or you go to someone who can make it or provide it. If you're a farmer and you need a tool repaired or a new tool made, you go to the blacksmith. The blacksmith will assess what you need, discuss the specifications, negotiate a price, and then create the tool. This isn't a quick transaction. It's a process that might take days or weeks, depending on how busy the blacksmith is, and you'll have to check back with the blacksmith multiple times to see if the work is done. The mainstream historical fact is that local craftspeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, millers, tanners, were crucial to the economy. They couldn't be easily replaced. A town needed a blacksmith. If the blacksmith left or died, the town had a serious problem. These people were valued because their skills were essential and rare. Here's the quirky detail. Some craftspeople had specific reputation and were known for quality work. If you were in need of a very specific item, a really good plough, a particularly well-made chest of drawers, you might travel significant distance to the specific craftsperson known for making that item. Word of mouth was how reputation spread, and reputation was everything. Barter was common. If you were a farmer with surplus grain and you needed cloth, you might trade grain to someone with extra cloth. Money was useful, but not universally available or trusted. Different regions might use different currencies. Someone might try to pay you with coins that aren't accepted in your area. So barter reduced uncertainty. You could trade goods you both understood value. Merchants were important intermediaries. A merchant in a larger town might buy goods from local craftspeople and then resell them. Merchants might travel between towns, buying goods in one place and selling them in another. Merchants accumulated information about what was available, what was in demand, and how to connect producers with buyers. Markets and fairs happened seasonally or annually. A town would have a market day, maybe once a week, where people came to sell goods. A fair, which was more annual or seasonal, would attract people from a wider area. These were social events as much as commercial events. People would come to buy and sell, but also to see people, socialize, and gather news. Prices weren't standardized. Everything was negotiable. When you went to buy something, you discussed the price. You might haggle. The merchant might reduce the price if you were a regular customer. This meant that the price you paid depended on your negotiating ability, your relationship with the seller, and circumstances. Is the merchant desperate to sell because they need money, or do they have surplus goods they're willing to keep? Buying things was an undertaking that required planning. You didn't just decide you wanted something and go buy it. You had to figure out if you could afford it. You had to find the person who made it or had it available. You had to navigate to their location. You had to negotiate. And you had to arrange payment and transport. A simple purchase might involve multiple steps and multiple days. Specialty goods, things not made locally, were rare and expensive. If you wanted something made in another region or another country, you had to either travel to get it, or rely on a merchant who handled that trade. This created a situation where certain goods were status symbols because they were expensive and difficult to acquire. Credit and debt were features of the system. You might buy something on credit from a merchant, paying it off over time. You might owe the blacksmith for work he did for you. These debts created relationships, but also created vulnerability. If you couldn't pay, you might face serious consequences. Historians still debate the extent to which local economies in pre-industrial America were self-sufficient versus dependent on trade with outside areas. The evidence suggests there was significant local production, but also significant trade. Not massive long-distance trade, but movement of goods between regions. The end result is that buying things was complicated, time-consuming, and involved direct negotiation. You knew the person making your goods or selling them to you. You understood roughly where they came from. You made conscious decisions about what you were buying. Commerce was not the frictionless, efficient system that modern retail is. It was slow, it required effort, but it probably created stronger relationships between producers and consumers. Seasonal living isn't an aesthetic choice or a trendy lifestyle. It's the fundamental reality of existing in a world where food production is completely dependent on seasons and where preservation is limited and imperfect. Summer is abundance. Fall is frantically trying to preserve that abundance. Winter is scarcity. Spring is carefully rationing stored goods while plants are starting to grow again. Summer through early fall is the season of food production. If you're a farmer, you're working constantly, planting, weeding, tending crops. If you're near woods or fields, you're hunting and gathering. The variety of available food is maximum. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, fresh meat if you can hunt it. Food is relatively abundant. This is when you eat well, when you have energy, when you can consume whatever you want because there's plenty. But this abundance has an expiration date. As fall approaches, you become hyper-aware that this is ending. You've got maybe a few months of fresh food, and then you have to rely on what you've preserved. So the work shifts to preservation. Hunting and fishing intensify. Harvesting accelerates. The work becomes frantic. You're trying to acquire and preserve as much food as possible before winter arrives. The mainstream historical fact is that most people's diet was significantly different by season. Summer and fall, fresh vegetables, fresh meat, fresh fruits. Winter and spring, preserved vegetables, preserved meat, stored root vegetables, bread. This meant that your nutritional intake varied dramatically by season. Winter diet was probably lower in certain vitamins and minerals that only come from fresh foods. Winter is the season of scarcity. Fresh food is gone. You're living on preserved food. The quality of your storage determines your options. If you have a good root cellar and you preserved food well, you have vegetables. If your preservation failed, you're eating bread, preserved meat, and whatever else keeps. The variety shrinks. Your diet becomes monotonous. You eat to survive, not to enjoy. Here's the quirky detail. Midwinter might involve a period of genuinely severe food scarcity. If you stored food and things went wrong, if crops failed the previous fall, if stored food spoiled, if your animals got sick, you might face actual hunger. You'd eat less, you'd eat whatever was available, and you'd hope that spring came soon. There are documented instances of communities and families facing starvation if preservation failed or if winter was particularly harsh. Spring is the transition season. Your stored foods are starting to run out. New plants are starting to grow, but they're not ready to harvest yet. Maybe you can eat greens from new growth. Maybe you can catch fish that are returning to streams. It's not abundant like summer, but it's more than winter, and it's a time of genuine hope because you know abundance is coming again. This seasonal cycle creates a rhythm to life that's completely foreign to modern people. Your energy level rises and falls with the seasons. Summer and fall are high energy, high work seasons. Winter is lower energy, lower work season, though not low. Animals still need care, equipment needs maintenance. Spring is a transition. Your mood was probably affected too. Summer optimism and energy. Fall anxiety about whether you're preserving enough. Winter depression and melancholy. Spring hope and anticipation. These weren't just psychological. They were tied to actual circumstance. You had reason for your mood. Clothing changed seasonally. You wore heavier clothes in winter, lighter in summer. You had to prepare clothes for each season. Winter clothes were stored in summer, and having them ready at the beginning of winter was a priority. Some wealthier people had different clothes for different seasons. Poorer people wore roughly the same clothes year-round, adjusting layers. Social rhythms changed seasonally too. Summer might have more social events, work parties, barn raisings, community gatherings that took advantage of good weather. Winter was more isolated. You spent more time at home with immediate family. Historians still debate how much seasonal affective disorder, depression linked to light changes, affected historical populations. But there's evidence suggesting that seasonal mood changes were real and affected people. The darkness and cold of winter probably contributed to depression, illness, and general misery. Spring brought genuine relief. The seasonal rhythm also meant that your expectations for life were tied to time of year. Certain things happened at certain times. You didn't ask, when should we plant? You knew when to plant because that's what happened in spring. You didn't wonder when harvest was. It was fall. The calendar was determined by agriculture and weather, not by human decision. By the time you reached adulthood, you were so synced with seasonal rhythms that you probably didn't even consciously notice it. Your energy rose and fell with the seasons. Your food varied, your work varied. It was just how life worked. Modern people, with electricity allowing us to ignore seasonal darkness, with refrigeration allowing us to eat the same things year-round, with climate-controlled spaces, have actually disconnected from these rhythms in a pretty dramatic way. Women's work in 1800s America is vast, invisible, and absolutely essential to survival. When historians talk about what people did, they usually talk about farming, blacksmithing, trading, the work that's visible and public. But the work that kept households actually functioning, that preserved food, that maintained the health of the family, that made clothing and maintained it, that work was done by women and is often not counted as work in historical records. Start with textile work. Making cloth from raw fibre was women's work. You took wool from sheep and carded it, combed it out to align the fibres. You spun it into yarn using a spinning wheel or a hand spindle. You dyed the yarn if you wanted it coloured. You wove the yarn into cloth. Or you took flax from plants and processed it similarly, but with additional steps, retting to separate fibres, breaking it, hackling, before spinning and weaving. This was incredibly time-consuming. A single garment required dozens of hours of labour spread across months. The mainstream historical fact is that women in colonial America spent 10 to 20 hours per week on textile production, on average. Over a year, that's 500 to 1,000 hours. Modern people spend maybe 5 to 10 hours per year on textile work, and that's probably generous. The difference in time investment is staggering. Food preservation, as we discussed earlier, was women's work. Preparing food for the table daily was women's work. Managing the pantry, planning meals, shopping at markets, dealing with merchants, all of this was women's work. Childcare and child-rearing was women's work. Caring for infants, training children, educating them in household skills, nursing them through illness. Women bore the responsibility for the health and development of children. This didn't mean men didn't care about children, they did. But the day-to-day physical care and responsibility was women's. Here's the quirky detail. Women's work wasn't invisible to people in the 1800s the way it sometimes feels invisible to modern historians. Within families, women's contributions were recognised and valued. Husbands and fathers understood that women's work was essential, but in terms of official record-keeping, in terms of economic statistics, women's work wasn't counted the same way men's work was. A man's occupation was farmer or blacksmith. A woman's occupation was housewife, which encompassed hundreds of hours of labour. Medicine and healthcare fell to women in many cases. If someone was sick, women nursed them. Women knew folk remedies. Women managed the health of the household. This responsibility included managing cleanliness, managing diet, managing medications, making decisions about when to call a healer or doctor. Women also often worked in support of their husband's trade. If the husband was a blacksmith, the wife might work the forge while he did other tasks. If the husband was a farmer, the wife might work in fields during intense labour times. Women's work was flexible in the sense that it adjusted to household needs. The physical demands of women's work were enormous. Hauling water, as we discussed earlier, kneeling to wash clothes, reaching to hang them, bending to tend fires, the repetitive motion of spinning and weaving and sewing. By middle age, women's bodies were probably marked by these physical demands: calloused hands, bad backs, chronic pain in joints. Historians still debate whether women worked more or less than men in 1800s agriculture. but they definitely worked differently. Men's work was more visible, more measured in terms of output, more tied to the market economy. Women's work was essential maintenance that happened regardless of market conditions. Pregnancy and childbirth added another layer to women's work. You didn't get to stop working because you were pregnant. You worked up until labour and then resumed shortly after giving birth. If complications arose, you might have more severe challenges, but the expectation was that you'd return to work quickly. This meant that the danger and pain of childbirth was overlaid on top of physical exhaustion from ongoing work. The invisibility of women's work in historical records means we know less about the details of their experience than we might. But from what we do know, from diaries, from legal documents, from economic analyses, it's clear that women's work was physically demanding, time-consuming and essential. And perhaps most importantly, women's work was never done. There was always laundry to do, always food to prepare, always clothing to mend, always children to manage. Unlike men's work, which might have a harvest season or a specific project that ends, women's work was cyclical and perpetual. It never finished. The bathroom situation in 1800s America is something that modern people struggle to fully comprehend in its unpleasantness. We've already touched on outhouses and chamber pots, but let's really sit with the reality of how bathroom needs were handled, because it's absolutely central to understanding what life was actually like. For many people, especially rural folk or people in lower economic circumstances, an outhouse was the bathroom. This was a small structure, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, maybe smaller, that was built over a hole dug into the ground. You opened the door, you sat on a wooden seat that had a hole in it, and you did your business into the hole. The hole was typically anywhere from 3 to 15 feet deep. When the hole was full, which took a long time but eventually happened, you either dug a new hole and moved the structure, or you hired someone to empty it. In winter, using an outhouse was genuinely miserable. It's freezing cold. The door doesn't seal well, so it's windy. You're sitting on a frozen wooden seat. You do your business as quickly as possible and return to the house. Some people kept outhouses heated slightly during winter, but most didn't. Some people had thunder mugs or chamber pots for winter use, meaning they urinated and defecated into a container inside the house, which was then emptied into the outhouse the next day. The mainstream historical fact is that outhouses were often placed relatively close to wells and water sources, both for convenience and because people didn't fully understand the connection between proximity of waste and water contamination. This created a perfect environment for waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. Here's the quirky detail. Outhouse placement became a subject of specific advice in agricultural almanacs and other guidebooks. Some people recognised that distance from wells was important, so there was genuine effort in some communities to space outhouses away from water sources. But this wasn't universal, and even when attempted, the understanding of just how far away was necessary wasn't really accurate by modern standards. In towns and cities, the bathroom situation was even more complicated. If you lived in a tenement or apartment building, you might have access to a shared outhouse serving multiple families. This meant more frequent emptying, more frequent maintenance issues, and more conflict between neighbours. If you were wealthy, you might have a water closet, a flush toilet that required plumbing, which was increasingly common in the latter 1800s in cities. But this required access to running water, which required either a well with a pump or municipal water, which was still being developed in most cities. Personal hygiene around bathroom use was minimal by modern standards. You might use water from a wash basin to clean yourself, but if water was scarce, you might just use toilet paper or cloth and move on. And yes, toilet paper, or at least the concept of it, existed, but it was expensive. Wealthier people might buy actual toilet paper. Poorer people used cloth scraps, newspapers, corn cobs, whatever was available. Women's menstruation was a practical challenge that intersected with bathroom needs. Menstrual products didn't exist in the modern sense. Women used cloth rags that they washed out after use. Managing menstruation while also managing other bodily functions in an outhouse or with chamber pots was just another indignity of life. The smell associated with outhouses was absolutely rank. Flies were attracted to the feces, which meant flies were constantly going in and out of the outhouse. These flies would then land on your food, on your body, on your clothes. They were a vector for disease, but also just a constant miserable presence. Some people kept quicklime or other materials at the outhouse to sprinkle over the waste to reduce smell and flies, but this was inconsistent. The combination of chamber pots inside the house and outhouses outside created multiple sources of smell and contamination. If you used a chamber pot at night and emptied it in the morning, that meant human urine and feces were being held in your living space overnight. Even if you emptied it quickly, the smell lingered. Cleaning the chamber pot required either going outside or using water from your precious supply and making your house smell worse. Historians still debate how much people's acceptance of bathroom-related filth and smell affected their health beliefs and practices, but there's no denying that living in constant contact with human waste, with the smell of it, with the knowledge that it's there, was a defining feature of daily life. The dignity-destroying aspect of this deserves mention. You had no privacy for basic bodily functions. If you used an outhouse at night, you might have neighbours aware that you're using the bathroom. If you used a chamber pot in a shared room, others knew you were using it. Bathroom needs weren't something you could handle discreetly. They were part of the reality that you lived in close quarters with other people. The modern flush toilet, which separates human waste from living spaces, is genuinely one of the most important public health innovations in history. It seems like a small thing, pressing a button to make waste disappear, but it fundamentally changed sanitation, disease rates, and quality of life. The technology was starting to be developed in the 1800s, but it was expensive and limited to wealthier people and urban areas. For most people, for most of the 1800s, bathroom needs meant dealing directly with human waste. Sleep in 1800s, America is not the consolidated 8-hour block that modern people expect. Research on historical sleep patterns suggests that before the widespread adoption of electric lighting, many people actually experienced segmented sleep, 2 periods of sleep separated by a period of wakefulness. This wasn't insomnia. This was a normal pattern where you might sleep for 4 hours, wake up for an hour or two, and then sleep for another 3 or 4 hours. What happened during that waking period? You might stoke the fire, use the chamber pot, work on household tasks that required less concentration, visit with your spouse, have sex, sit by the fire and read or sew, or just lie awake thinking. It was night time, so you couldn't work outside, but there were productive things you could do. The mainstream historical fact is that this segmented sleep pattern is probably the natural human sleep rhythm when you're not exposed to artificial light. Studies done on people kept in darkness, with no artificial lighting, show that they naturally fall into segmented sleep. We may have changed human sleep when we invented electricity and artificial lighting, pushing everyone toward one long consolidated sleep period. Here's the quirky detail. References to first sleep and second sleep appear in literature and documents from the 1700s and 1800s. People acknowledged these 2 periods of sleep as normal. Prayers and devotionals were written for the waking period between sleeps. People discussed in diaries what they did during the watch between sleeps. It was recognized as a normal part of the sleep cycle. But regardless of whether sleep was segmented or consolidated, sleep was more tied to darkness than it is now. When the sun set, you started getting ready for bed. When it was dark, you slept. You might stay up late by candlelight for special occasions, but this was expensive because candles were expensive. Most of the time, you went to bed not long after dark. Bedtime required preparation. You needed to change into night clothes, which might be as simple as removing outer layers and keeping on undergarments, or might involve actual nightgowns or nightshirts if you had them. You might use a chamber pot before bed. You'd make sure the fire was banked so it would stay alive but not burn the house down overnight. Sleeping arrangements varied by class and region. Wealthy people might have private bedrooms. Working-class families might share sleeping spaces. A typical working-class family might have 2 rooms, a main room where cooking, eating and family time happened, and a bedroom where multiple people slept. Children often shared beds with siblings or with parents. Privacy was not a given. Bedding was variable. Straw mattresses were common. Basically ticking stuffed with straw, which was uncomfortable, and which had to be periodically refreshed with new straw. You'd have blankets or quilts for warmth. Sheets existed but weren't universal. Some people used cloth to separate skin from the mattress. Some people didn't bother. Insects in the bed were a constant issue. Bedbugs would infest your bedding. Lice were common. Fleas from animals or from people would end up in your bed. You'd sleep in an itchy, uncomfortable bed knowing that insects were feeding on you. Some people might sleep with a light source nearby, a candle or lamp, thinking that insects wouldn't come near light, but this was ineffective. The temperature in your sleeping area was determined by proximity to the heat source. If the main room had the stove, bedrooms would be colder. Huddling together for warmth was literally how you stayed warm. Multiple people in one bed made sense for practical reasons, not just space saving. Historians still argue about the extent to which sleep quality was affected by the conditions people slept in. Presumably you could get used to cold, to insects, to hard mattresses. But there's no denying that the circumstances were far from ideal by modern standards. Sleep was also interrupted by various things. Babies cried, animals made noise, weather was audible. If you lived in a town, noise from neighbours was possible. Your sleep wasn't the uninterrupted quiet that modern white noise machines are trying to recreate. It was interrupted, unstable, and often uncomfortable. And yet people slept. You adapted. You got tired enough that you could sleep in conditions that would prevent modern people from sleeping. You learned to sleep deeply despite discomfort. Your body just accepted it and got the rest it needed despite circumstances. The darkness of night was profound. If you woke up in the night and needed to see something, you had to light a candle, which was expensive. So you'd grope around in darkness, trying to navigate with minimal vision. This meant knowing your space intimately, knowing exactly where things were, knowing how to move around without bumping into things. The psychological effect of this kind of sleep, interrupted in darkness, with insects, in cold, in close quarters with other people, was probably significant. But people adapted. This was their baseline. They didn't know any different. Fire in an 1800s American home is not just a source of warmth and light, it's the centre of everything. Fire is how you cook. Fire is how you heat water. Fire is how you get light. Fire is how you keep warm. And fire is also a constant present danger. You're living with an open flame in a wooden structure. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and your house burns down. Maintaining fire requires constant attention. You need to feed wood into the stove or fireplace. You need to manage the airflow. You need to clean ash. You need to maintain the chimney to prevent it from catching fire from internal creosote buildup. The process of keeping a fire going through the night requires banking the fire carefully, arranging the coals so they'll burn slowly through the night, and still have live coals in the morning to rekindle into flame. The process of starting a fire from scratch involves flint and steel, or friction-based methods that require skill and patience. You're trying to create a spark or heat that ignites tinder, dry material that catches easily. Tinder might be dried grass, pine needles, pieces of cloth, anything that catches easily. Once the tinder is burning, you add kindling, small pieces of wood, until you have a flame. Once you have a flame, you slowly add larger pieces of wood until you have a functional fire. The whole process might take 15 minutes to half an hour if you're efficient. The mainstream historical fact is that fire was so important that specific people were sometimes designated as firekeepers in communities. They would maintain a public fire that people could come to and take coals if their own fire went out. This was preferable to trying to start a fire from scratch, especially in winter when everything is damp. Here's the quirky detail. Fire maintenance knowledge was considered important enough to be passed down and taught. Children learned how to manage fire. You knew how to bank a fire, how to kindle a fire from coals, how to recognize when fire was dying and needed more wood. These skills were essential because the difference between having heat and light and not having them was significant. The danger of fire was constant. Flames could spread quickly, a spark could land on something flammable, a child could get too close to the fire and get burned. An adult could brush against flames while cooking and catch their clothing on fire. Especially for women whose clothing was long and whose work kept them near the stove, fire burns were a real occupational hazard. House fires were catastrophic. A wooden house with fire in the interior would burn quickly. Firefighting capabilities were limited in rural areas. You might not have access to enough water. In towns, you might have a fire brigade, but they were often volunteer and often overwhelmed. A house fire could spread to neighbouring structures. A single fire could burn down an entire block if conditions were right. Fire safety knowledge probably existed at some level. People understood that fire was dangerous and that you should be careful, but the combination of necessary fire for survival and danger of fire meant that you just had to live with the risk. You couldn't eliminate the danger, you could only minimise it through careful management. The warmth of fire was essential in winter. You stayed close to it. You warmed your clothes by it. The heat from the fire was the only heat most homes had. Living far from the fire meant living in cold. So despite the danger, people gathered close to fire because the alternative was being cold. Fire smoke in living spaces was probably significant. A wood-burning stove or fireplace pumps smoke into the house. Some of it goes up the chimney, but some lingers. Your eyes probably burn from smoke. Your lungs probably take damage. People probably developed chronic respiratory issues from years of living with wood smoke, though they wouldn't understand that this was the cause. The smell of burning wood became part of your identity. Your clothes smelled like smoke. Your hair smelled like smoke. Your house smelled like smoke. This was normal. This was what home smelled like. Historians still debate the extent to which wood smoke exposure affected health, but modern research on indoor air pollution from wood burning suggests it's probably significant. Particulate matter from smoke contributes to respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease and other health problems. But fire was also comfort. A fire meant warmth. A fire meant hot food. A fire meant light. A fire meant safety from darkness. And while it was dangerous, it was also necessary. Life without fire wasn't possible in winter, at least not with any degree of comfort or survival. The end of fire in your home, if your fire went out and you couldn't restart it, was a genuine crisis. You'd lose heat, you'd lose the ability to cook, you'd have to rely on a neighbour's fire or a communal fire until you could get yours going again. So maintaining fire was a daily priority. Community and isolation in 1800s. America exists in tension with each other. You're in close community with your neighbours and fellow townspeople, but you're also relatively isolated from broader networks. You have almost no privacy, but you also have significant interdependence. Life is lived in close quarters with others, and this affects everything about how society functions. If you live in a rural area, you might have relatively few immediate neighbours. Your farm might be separated from others by significant distance. But you still see these neighbours regularly at work events, barn raisings, harvesting help, road maintenance. You see them at church, you probably see them at market or social events. In smaller communities, you know everyone and everyone knows you. The mainstream historical fact is that barn raisings and similar cooperative work events were essential infrastructure. If someone needed to build a barn, their neighbours would come together and build it in a day or two. This wasn't charity, it was reciprocal. You helped, and when you needed help, others would help you. This created strong community bonds and also created a system where you couldn't afford to have a bad reputation. Here's the quirky detail. Gossip and reputation were incredibly important because they were your only mechanism of social control. If someone cheated you, if someone was unreliable, if someone was untrustworthy, everyone in the community would know. You couldn't hide anything. You couldn't reinvent yourself by moving to a new town and starting fresh very easily, because news would travel and your reputation would follow. This probably made people more honest, more reliable, and more concerned with community perception. But the lack of privacy was also stifling. If you had a disagreement with your spouse, neighbours probably knew. If you were struggling financially, people noticed. If you were sick, people knew. If you had conflict with someone, the community was aware. There was no escape from social scrutiny. This probably created significant stress and contributed to people being careful about maintaining appearances even when their actual situation was difficult. Small-town gossip was a major form of entertainment and news. Information spread through conversations at wells, at markets, at church. Major events in people's lives became common knowledge. The death of someone, the illness of someone, births, romantic entanglements, these became topics of discussion. There was a certain fascination with what was happening in people's lives, partly because entertainment options were limited, and partly because community events were genuinely interesting. Romance and courtship happened in public view. A young man courting a young woman was something the community observed. The couple couldn't have privacy for their relationship. They had to navigate romance in a context where the community was aware and potentially commenting. Religious life was community life. Church was not just a spiritual practice, it was a social event. You saw people, you gathered, you participated together. Church provided structure to your week and connection to community. Conflict resolution happened through community mechanisms. If two people had a dispute, they might go to a respected community member or to the church for mediation. The community had interest in resolving conflicts because unresolved conflict was disruptive. The class structure was visible. Wealthier people were known, poorer people were known. Someone's social status was relatively fixed. You knew where you fit in the hierarchy, This probably created some stability but also perpetuated inequality. Historians still debate whether tight community bonds in pre-industrial societies were more satisfying than modern loose connections, or whether they were suffocating and limiting. Evidence suggests both. People had strong social connections but also limited freedom and constant social pressure. The isolation aspect came from distance and from limited communication. Your world was relatively small. You knew your region, but anything beyond that was vague and foreign. The broader world existed but was distant and not relevant to your daily life. This created a kind of provincial mindset where your immediate community was the centre of your world. But modern isolation, where you can be surrounded by people but emotionally alone, where you can be on the internet but not know your neighbours, is a different kind of isolation. 1800s. Isolation was about distance and difficulty of communication. Modern isolation is about choice and technology. Neither is ideal, but they're different. The end result is that you lived your entire life in close relationship with the same people. You probably spent your entire life in the same region or area. You understood social norms well, because you were immersed in them. You had strong connections to people, but also no escape from social pressure. This created a world that was stable, somewhat predictable, but also limiting and sometimes suffocating. Poverty versus comfort in 1800 standards is a spectrum that goes from desperate survival to relative security with some minor luxuries. Everyone was poor by modern standards, but within the 1800s, significant variation existed. The difference between someone who was truly desperate and someone who was merely working class was significant and affected daily life in measurable ways. At the bottom of the spectrum, you have people who don't have secure housing. Maybe they're homeless, or maybe they're constantly in danger of losing shelter. Maybe they're living in a one-room shanty or in a basement apartment in a city. They don't have much food. They're probably malnourished. They're cold in winter. They get sick frequently because their immune system is compromised by malnutrition. They die young. Life expectancy for the very poor is significantly lower than for working class or middle class people. Above that, you have working poor or working class people who have stable housing, usually a small farm or a craftsperson's home. They have enough food, but it's not varied. They wear clothes that are patched and worn. They have maybe one good outfit that they wear to church or important events. They work constantly. But they have stability. They have shelter. They have the basic necessities. The mainstream historical fact is that class in the 1800s, especially in rural America, was less rigidly defined than in Europe, but it still existed. You could potentially improve your class status through effort and luck, acquiring land, developing a trade skill, marrying up. But most people stayed in roughly the same class they were born in. Moving up in class meant accumulating resources. Maybe you save enough money to buy land. Maybe you acquire tools and start trade. Maybe you have connections that lead to an opportunity. This required not just work, but also luck and circumstances outside your control. Here's the quirky detail. Certain luxuries marked class status. If you had glass windows in your house, that was a sign of relative wealth. If you had multiple rooms, that was a sign of comfort. If you had furniture beyond basic necessities, that was a sign of status. If you had candles beyond what you needed and could afford to burn them for light, that was a sign of wealth. These small things marked where you fit in the hierarchy. Food quality varied dramatically. Poor people ate bread and maybe some vegetables. Working class people ate bread, vegetables, and preserved meat. More comfortable people might have fresh meat regularly. Wealthy people had access to varied food, spices, and foods that others couldn't afford. Clothing quality and variety showed class. Poor people had one or two sets of clothes that were worn, patched, and falling apart. Working class people had a few sets of clothes, some still wearable, some worn. More comfortable people had multiple sets of clothes, including some that were actually nice. Wealthy people had clothes for different occasions and seasons. Health outcomes were affected by class. Poor people didn't have access to healers unless they could pay. Working class people might have access to someone who could help if things got serious. More comfortable people could afford a doctor. Wealthy people could afford multiple opinions and better care. Education availability was affected by class. Poor people got no education. Working class people might get some education. Comfortable people might educate their children more thoroughly. Wealthy people could afford to pay for education. The psychological experience of poverty was probably significant. If you're poor, you're constantly stressed about survival. Will you have enough food? Will you be able to keep your housing? What happens if you get sick? These anxieties are constant. Being working class didn't eliminate these worries, but they were perhaps less acute. Historians still debate whether class mobility was genuinely possible in 1800s America, or whether mobility was so limited that class was essentially inherited. Evidence suggests some mobility was possible, but most people stayed in their class of origin. The distance between poor and wealthy was significant. A wealthy person might have a house with multiple rooms, nice furniture, good food, and the ability to not work with their hands. A poor person might be one illness or one failed crop away from destitution. But the boundary between working class and poor was also significant. Stability was valuable. Knowing you'd have shelter and food was worth something. And everyone was poor by modern standards. Even relatively wealthy 1800s, people didn't have electricity, running water, antibiotics, or any of the basic technologies that make modern life possible. Relative comfort in the 1800s still meant constant labour, constant risk, and constant struggle. But the difference between comfortable struggle and desperate struggle was meaningful. Comparing then and now, life with electricity and running water and modern medicine to life in 1800s, America, without any of these things, creates a sense of genuine gratitude, or at least should. But it also creates understanding about what humans are capable of. People built societies, created art, formed relationships, and found meaning in conditions that would be devastating to modern people. We should recognise that, but we should also recognise that we've genuinely improved life in measurable ways. The light in your room, the electric light, is the most obvious miracle. You can turn it on any time you want. You can read, you can see clearly, you can work. You're not dependent on fire or candles or the position of the sun. Night is not darkness anymore. Night is just a time when you choose to sleep instead of work. This seems like such a small thing, but it fundamentally changed human experience. Running water from a tap. Hot water that appears without building a fire and waiting. Water that you can use liberally for washing, for drinking, for cooling. You don't haul water in buckets. You don't boil it in massive vats. You turn a tap and water comes out. This single technology prevented diseases, improved sanitation, gave people more free time, and made life dramatically more comfortable. Refrigeration. Your food doesn't spoil. You can eat fresh food year-round. You're not dependent on preservation and seasonal diet. You're not surviving on salt and smoke for 6 months of the year. You can eat varied, nutritious food every day. This affects your health, your energy, and your experience of food. Medicine. If you get sick, there's actually something that can help. Antibiotics eliminate infections that would kill you in the 1800s. Vaccines prevent diseases that killed children. Surgery can actually heal you instead of maybe killing you. Yes, modern medicine has problems, but compared to 1800s medicine, it's miraculous. Climate control. Your house stays warm in winter and cool in summer. You don't face the danger of freezing. You don't face the stress of managing fire constantly. You don't bunch up with other people for warmth. You sleep comfortably. This affects your health and your mood. The mainstream historical fact is that life expectancy increased dramatically from the 1800s to today. Average lifespan was probably 35 to 40 years in the 1800s, though this is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survive to adulthood, you might live to 60 plus. Modern life expectancy is 75 plus. This increase is due to decreased infant mortality, decreased deaths from infectious disease, better nutrition, and access to modern medicine. Here's the quirky detail. Some aspects of modern life are arguably worse than 1800s life. Modern work is different, but not necessarily easier. We've shifted from physical exhaustion to mental exhaustion and time stress. Modern diet is easier to acquire, but worse for you. Modern social connection is easier to access, but more shallow. Modern information is abundant, but can be overwhelming. So we've gained some things and lost others. But let's be clear, you would not survive in 1800s America. You would get sick and die. Or you would get an infection and die. Or you would get hurt and die of infection. Or you would struggle with the physical labour and mental stress and eventually break. Modern humans, lacking the conditioning and cultural knowledge to survive without electricity, would have a genuinely hard time. We're soft in ways that are both good and problematic. The luxury of choice that you have is something that 1800s people didn't really have. You choose what to wear. You choose what to eat. You choose how to spend your time. Most of these choices didn't exist for most people then. You did what was necessary. You didn't make choices based on preference. You made choices based on necessity and circumstance. Your comfort is a genuine achievement of technology and collective effort. Your bed is soft. Your house is climate controlled. Your food is safe and varied. Your life expectancy is high. Your infant mortality is low. You have access to education, to entertainment, to healthcare. These are not small things. These are genuine improvements in the human condition. But here's the flip side. All of this comfort and convenience has a cost. The systems that provide electricity, water, food, and everything else require resources. They create pollution. They require participation in complex economic systems. Modern life is more comfortable, but it's also more complicated and more connected to global systems that you don't fully control. In 1800s America, your life was constrained by nature and distance. You couldn't travel far. You couldn't communicate across distance. You couldn't access things that weren't produced locally. But you also probably understood your supply chains. You knew where your food came from. You knew the people making your goods. There was a kind of directness to your relationship to the world that's been lost. This doesn't mean 1800s life was better. It clearly wasn't. More people died. People suffered from diseases that we've eliminated. People lived harder, worked more, had fewer choices, but maybe understanding what was traded away helps us appreciate what we've gained. The light in your bedroom, the water in your tap, the food in your refrigerator, the medicine in your cabinet, these are miracles. You should be grateful. And you should understand that people without these things are not better people or more connected to nature or more authentic. They're just people struggling with circumstances that we've moved past. We've genuinely improved the human condition. And so we come to the end of our journey through an 1800s American night without electricity. Picture yourself now, lying in your own bed, in your warm room, with its electric light dimmed to a soft glow, feeling the weight of quilts and blankets that are actually comfortable because they're not straw and wool. Can you feel it? The softness of a modern mattress, the climate control keeping the temperature exactly where you want it, the security of knowing that water can be obtained with a simple turn of a handle, and that food in your kitchen won't spoil. The people we've followed through this story were real. They were your ancestors probably, or people very much like them. They woke without alarms to roosters they couldn't quiet. They hauled water until their shoulders screamed. They cooked over fires that threatened their lives. They worked from sunrise to sunset, doing labour that bent and broke their bodies. They got sick and often died from infections we can cure with a pill. They lived in darkness half the year. They knew hunger. And yet they built things. They created communities. They fell in love, raised children, made art, told stories, and found joy in circumstances that would devastate modern people. They were stronger than we are, or they had to be. Their capacity to endure, to accept hardship without complaint because complaint changed nothing. This was something we've perhaps lost in our comfort. As you drift towards sleep, think about the electricity in your walls, the running water in your pipes, the medicine in your cabinet. These are not luxuries. These are miracles. These are achievements of human ingenuity and effort that have genuinely improved life. You live in a time of unprecedented comfort and safety. But also remember that time, not that long ago, just 5 or 6 generations back, where people lived without these things. They were not inferior people. They were different people, in different circumstances, and understanding their world, comprehending their struggle, makes your own comfort deeper and more meaningful. So sleep now in your warm, dry, safe bed. Appreciate the miracle of electricity, of running water, of modern medicine. Rest easy knowing that you will wake tomorrow to an alarm you choose, to light that you control, to hot water that appears instantly, to a day of choices and comfort that would have seemed impossible to the people we visited tonight. You're lucky. Remember that. And as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, let gratitude be your final thought. Sweet dreams.